The train whistle had been screaming for the last 20 minutes, which Eleanor Whitmore found both irritating and, in a strange way, comforting. Noise was familiar. Noise meant something was happening, even if that something was just iron wheels grinding against iron rails through a landscape so empty it made her chest ache. She pressed her forehead against the window glass. The cold seeped through immediately, and she didn't pull back. Outside, the Oklahoma Territory rolled past in shades of brown and gray and the particular pale yellow of grass that had given up on the season. There were no trees to speak of. There were occasional clusters of cattle standing perfectly still in fields, looking at nothing, which Eleanor thought was either very peaceful or very stupid, and she couldn't decide which. There was red earth where the wind had scraped away the grass entirely. There were fence posts with no fence attached to them, just standing there in the middle of nothing, which seemed to her like the most honest thing she'd seen in weeks. She was 23 years old. She had $31 in the bottom of her traveling bag, folded into a handkerchief that smelled like her mother's kitchen back in Ohio. She had two dresses that were respectable, one that was not, a pair of boots with a crack in the left heel that she'd been meaning to get repaired since August, and a letter from a man named Gerald Whitfield that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Dear Miss Norris, the letter began. Norris was her mother's name. She'd used it for the correspondence, which in retrospect felt both cautious and ridiculous. I'm a man of 42 years, widower, owner of the Whitfield Ranch outside Red Hollow, Oklahoma Territory. I'm seeking a wife of sound character and practical disposition. I can offer a comfortable home, financial stability, and the honest companionship of a hardworking man. I do not make promises I cannot keep, and I would ask the same of you. She had written back. He had written again. They had exchanged 6 letters, total over 4 months. In none of them had he been particularly warm, but he had been consistent, and Eleanor had come to understand that consistency was a kind of warmth, just slower. The 7th letter had been from her. I will arrive on the 15th. She had not received a response, but she'd assumed that was because the mail was slow, or he was busy, or men like Gerald Whitfield simply didn't write letters that said, "Wonderful, I'll be there." Men like that showed up. She had counted on it. The train began to slow. Eleanor straightened in her seat and gathered her bag from the overhead shelf, the weight of it familiar in her hands. She checked the buttons on her coat, all present, and pushed a loose strand of dark hair back under her hat. The other passengers in the car were also gathering themselves, a family with 3 small children who had been making noise the entire trip, an older man who slept through everything, including what she was fairly certain had been a brief derailment scare somewhere outside of Tulsa, and a young woman traveling alone who had spent the journey reading the same page of a novel over and over, which Eleanor understood completely. The station at Red Hollow was smaller than she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected, exactly. Not Chicago, certainly, but something with more than one platform and a sign that wasn't missing half its letters. Whole augu, the sign said, which felt like an omen she didn't have time to interpret. She stepped off the train onto a platform of weathered planks and stood still for a moment, letting the cold air hit her properly. It was colder here than in Ohio had been, which surprised her. She'd thought going south meant warmth, but the territory had its own understanding of weather, and it wasn't interested in her expectations. She looked around. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform, a man unloading crates, 2 women talking near the station door. A boy of about 12 leading a horse by the reins with the bored authority of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. A porter moving luggage. An elderly man with a cane sitting on a bench as though he'd been there since the station was built and simply hadn't left. No Gerald Whitfield. She waited. The train finished unloading. The family with the children moved past her, the smallest one staring at Eleanor with the unguarded scrutiny of a child who hasn't learned yet that staring is rude. Eleanor stared back mildly, and the child looked away. She waited another 10 minutes. The platform emptied. Even the elderly man with the cane eventually rose and shuffled off somewhere. Eleanor set her bag down by her feet and looked at the town beyond the station. One main street, a general store, what appeared to be a saloon, a livery stable, a land office with a freshly painted sign, a small building that might have been a doctor's office or a dentist's office or both, because out here those things were often the same person. Nowhere in any of it was a rancher of 42 years with a practical disposition and a letter that said, "I do not make promises I cannot keep." She pulled the letter from her bag anyway and read the address again. Red Hollow Station, 15th. She had the date right. "Miss Norris?" She turned. The man standing at the edge of the platform was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two either side of it, tall in the way that suggested he'd grown up doing work that required it, rather than height for its own sake. He wore a coat that had seen better years and a hat with a dent in the brim. His boots were clean, which meant he'd made some effort. He was holding, and this was the thing she noticed most, because it was strange, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Still warm, she could see faint steam rising from it in the cold air. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she said, because Norris had always been temporary. "Are you Gerald Whitfield?" Something moved across the man's face. Not quite a wince. Something quieter than that. "No, ma'am," he said. "My name's Rhett Callahan. I worked for Mr. Whitfield." He paused. "I'm real sorry to be the one to tell you this." She heard the past tense before the rest of it. "He's dead," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like saying something out loud to make it real before she decided how to feel about it. "Yes, ma'am. 4 days ago. It was his heart, is what Doc Garner said. He'd been having trouble with it for a while, but—" Rhett Callahan stopped himself, as if he'd realized he was filling silence with details she hadn't asked for. He didn't know he was going to pass when he wrote you. I want you to know that. He wasn't a man who would have done this on purpose." "No," Eleanor said. "He didn't strike me as that kind of man." A silence stretched between them. She looked down at the bread in his hands, then back up at his face, because she needed somewhere to look that wasn't the empty town or the empty platform or the horizon that went on forever in every direction. "Is that for me?" she asked. He looked at the bread as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. "Mrs. Pruitt at the boarding house. She figured you'd be hungry after the trip. She didn't know what else to send. It was kind of her." Eleanor held out her hand. After a moment, he gave her the bread. "What happens to the ranch now?" Rhett Callahan's jaw moved slightly. "That's complicated." "Of course it is," she said. He'd brought a wagon, which she was grateful for. Her bag was heavier than it looked, and the ranch was 4 miles outside of town on a road that was more suggestion than fact. Eleanor sat on the wagon bench with the bread in her lap and watched the land go by and tried to think clearly, which was difficult when the ground kept shifting under what she'd thought was a settled plan. She had not been in love with Gerald Whitfield. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She'd read his letters and she'd thought, this is a man I could respect, and that's enough. She'd thought, I am 23 and Ohio is small and I have been careful my whole life, and careful has not gotten me anywhere particularly interesting. She'd thought, a ranch is a real thing, land is a real thing, and a man who says what he means is rarer than he should be. She had not thought, what if he dies? Was he sick for long, she asked, because the silence in the wagon had become its own kind of weight. More than a year, Rhett said, watching the road. He didn't talk about it much, not the kind of man who talked about his own troubles. No, he wasn't. She paused. You knew him well? 8 years, since I was about 22. He glanced at her briefly. He was a fair man, strict about some things, but fair. Did he have family? A sister back in Tennessee. I sent word. Haven't heard back yet. Eleanor nodded. She looked at her hands in her lap. Bare, no gloves, because she'd left them on the train like an idiot and hadn't realized until they were an hour outside of Red Hollow. Her knuckles were red from the cold. What's complicated about it? She asked. The ranch? Rhett didn't answer immediately. He moved the reins from one hand to the other. There's debts, he said finally. More than there should be. Mr. Whitfield was careful with money, always had been. So the numbers don't quite make sense. And there's a man named Victor Harlan who's been making noises about the property. What kind of noises? The kind that sound like offers but aren't, really. Eleanor turned to look at him properly for the first time. His face and profile was angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against something and hadn't relaxed since. He wasn't handsome in the easy way that men sometimes were, the kind that didn't cost them anything. He was something more weathered than that. His hands on the reins were large and scarred at the knuckles from what looked like older, harder work than ranch hand duties. "And you?" she said. "What happens to you if the ranch goes?" He was quiet for a moment. "I find something else." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "I built 2 of those fence lines myself," he said. "Dug the well in the north pasture. Spent 3 winters on that property. So I reckon what happens to me is, it goes, and I take that with me. The knowing of it." She looked back at the road. "I'm not going back to Ohio," she said. "Ma'am, I know that's probably what you're thinking, that I'll take the next train back and then this is all somebody else's problem. I'm telling you, I'm not." "I wasn't thinking that." "You were a little." The corner of his mouth moved, almost nothing, barely enough to count. "Maybe a little," he allowed. "I have $31 and a return ticket I'm going to sell," she said. "I can cook, keep accounts, mend things, and I'm not afraid of work. I don't know anything about cattle, but I can learn." She paused. "If there are debts, we need to know what they actually are before we decide they can't be fixed. And if someone's making offers on the property, we should know exactly why." Rhett looked at her. It was a longer look than he'd given her before. "We," he said. "Someone has to live in that house," she said. "It might as well be someone who's going to do something useful while they're there." He turned back to the road. The wagon rolled on. In the distance, she could just make out the shape of a house against the gray sky, and beside it, a barn, and beyond that, the flat, dark line of winter pasture stretching toward nothing. "It's not a comfortable house," he said. "I didn't come here for comfortable." The Whitfield Ranch looked exactly like what it was, a working property that had been managed by a man who cared about function and not much else. The main house was 2 stories, built from lumber that had weathered to a silver gray, with a porch that sagged on the left side and a window on the upper floor that had been boarded over rather than repaired. There was a well, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that needed new wire on one side, and a barn large enough to hold a decent number of horses and equipment. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, and Eleanor had learned to trust solid things more than beautiful ones. A woman came out of the house as the wagon pulled up, mid-50s, stout, with gray hair pinned severely, and an expression that didn't immediately commit to either welcome or suspicion. "This is Dora," Rhett said. "She's been helping with the house since Mr. Whitfield passed." "Dora Flagg," the woman said to Eleanor directly, as if Rhett hadn't spoken. "You're the mail order girl." "Eleanor Whitmore," Eleanor said, stepping down from the wagon without waiting for help. "I'm not a girl, and I'm aware of the situation." Dora Flagg examined her for a moment. "You staying?" "Yes." Something in the woman's face shifted fractionally toward the favorable. "There's soup on. You look like you haven't eaten since Ohio." "I had bread," Eleanor said, holding up the loaf. "That's not a meal." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Inside, the house was what she'd expected from the outside. Functional, slightly neglected, smelling of wood smoke and old leather, and the particular cold that settles into a house when the person who's been living in it isn't there anymore. The furniture was heavy and practical, the kind made to last rather than to impress. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace there was a photograph in a wooden frame. A man she assumed was Gerald Whitfield, standing beside a horse, squinting into the sun. He looked older than 42. He looked tired in the particular way of men who work land, which is a tiredness that goes all the way down. "I'm sorry," she thought, looking at the photograph. "I think you were a decent man, and I'm sorry." Then she turned away from it because standing there looking at the picture of a dead man she'd never met wasn't going to fix anything. She spent the first 2 days learning the house. This was not a sentimental project. She went through every room methodically, opening drawers and checking shelves and looking in the places people kept things they didn't want found, under mattresses, in the backs of wardrobes, in tins labeled something other than what they contained. She was looking for accounts, for letters, for anything that would tell her what Gerald Whitfield had actually known about the state of his own property. What she found was more than she'd expected and less than she'd hoped for. In the study off the main hall, a small room with a desk, a single chair, and shelves of ledgers that smelled of must and old ink, she found the ranch's financial records going back 12 years. She also found a stack of correspondence, a locked tin box that she opened with a hairpin after 20 minutes of effort, and a promissory note she didn't immediately understand. She sat at that desk for 4 hours on the second day, going through numbers. Rhett found her there at supper time, still at the desk with the lamp lit and 3 ledgers open around her. "You haven't eaten," he said from the doorway. "I'm aware." Dora made, "In a minute." She put her finger on a line in the current ledger. "Come here and look at this." He came in, though she could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable in the study. He stood beside her and looked at where she was pointing. "This is what the ranch owes in outstanding debts," she said. "According to this ledger, $940. I know, it's why Harlan's don't, but look at this." She pulled the second ledger across. "This is 2 years ago. The ranch was running a surplus. Not a large one, but consistent. Cattle prices held, the beef contracts were solid. There's no reason for that surplus to have turned into $900 of debt in 24 months without something unusual happening." Rhett was quiet for a moment, looking at the columns. "You read accounts." "My father was a merchant. I kept his books from the time I was 15. She didn't add, "And he let me do it because he was drinking and couldn't manage them himself, but I learned them properly anyway." "Look at August of last year. There's a withdrawal here, $320, listed as operating expenses. No specification. Nothing else that month comes close to that number. Mr. Whitfield didn't pull $300 for operating expenses." "How do you know?" "Because I was here, and nothing happened in August that cost $300. He paused. "There was a fence repair. $60 maybe. And we bought 2 new horses in July, but that was accounted for separately. I saw the receipt." Eleanor leaned back in the chair and looked at the ledger. "Someone changed these numbers," she said. "After the fact, I think. The ink color is slightly different on the entry lines than on the headers, which were probably written at the start of the year. And the handwriting is close, but not quite." She pointed. "See how the 7s are written? In this entry, it's a European 7 with the crossbar. The rest of Gerald's numbers don't have that." Rhett looked. He was close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air and the clean soap smell of someone who'd washed up before coming in for supper. "Who had access to this study?" she asked. "Mr. Whitfield, mostly. Dora, for cleaning, and—" He stopped. "And? And once, maybe 6 months back, a man from Harlan's office came out to look over the records. Mr. Whitfield let him in because there was some kind of formal request about a grazing easement. I don't remember the details. I wasn't in the room." Eleanor closed the ledger slowly. She thought about the $940 of debt. She thought about Victor Harlan's offers on the property. She thought about the promissory note she'd found in the locked tin, which named Harlan's Cattle Company as the creditor. "He's been manufacturing a debt," she said. Rhett looked at her. "Or inflating a real one," she continued. "Either way, the ranch appears to owe money it doesn't actually owe, and the creditor on that note is Harlan himself." She tapped the closed ledger with 2 fingers. "He can call the note whenever he chooses. If the estate can't pay, and $900 against a recently deceased owner with a confused inheritance is exactly the kind of situation that can't easily be resolved. He can claim the property as settlement." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing against the boarded window like it wanted in. "You figured all that out in 4 hours, Rhett said. 3.5. I spent the first half hour looking for the hairpin to get the tin open." She stood up because her back was aching from the chair. "I need to see the original purchase records for the property, and I need to find out if there are any other creditors or if it's all Harlan. The purchase records would be in the land office in town. Then I'll go tomorrow." "Miss Whitmore." Something in his voice made her stop. Not a warning, exactly. Something more careful than that. Victor Harlan is not a man who... He has a lot of influence in Red Hollow. People don't generally push back against him. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Do you believe the ranch is worth saving?" "Yes." "Do you believe Gerald Whitfield was a decent man who got cheated?" "Yes." "Then tell me how it helps him or the ranch or anyone else to let Harlan take what he stole." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. His jaw did that thing again, that small set motion, like something settling into place. "It doesn't," he said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She slept in the upstairs room that had been intended as a guest room, on a bed with a mattress that was acceptable and a quilt that was excellent, probably made by Gerald Whitfield's dead wife, whose name Eleanor had learned was Clara, and who had died 6 years ago of a fever that nobody had been able to do anything about. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about what she'd agreed to. She was 23 years old. She had no formal claim on this property. She was a woman who had come to marry a man and found him already buried. By every conventional measure, her situation was about as precarious as it was possible for a situation to be without involving actual physical danger. But she'd found something in those ledgers that bothered her in a way she couldn't leave alone. The careful, deliberate alteration of those numbers, not sloppy, not accidental, but methodical, designed to look routine to someone not paying close attention, that bothered her deeply. It was a particular kind of meanness, the kind that hid behind paperwork and called itself business. She had known men like Victor Harlan, not him specifically, but the type, men who had decided early on that rules were for people who couldn't afford to ignore them and had spent their lives proving it. Men who took things not because they needed them, but because they could, and because taking things that belonged to someone else was a way of proving you were more than that person. She didn't intend to let him prove that here. She turned over and pulled the quilt higher and closed her eyes and let herself be tired for exactly 20 minutes, because that was all she could afford. The land office in Red Hollow was run by a man named Bricker, who had the general appearance of someone who had been startled once, a long time ago, and had never quite recovered. He was thin, with large eyes and a habit of beginning sentences before he'd decided how to finish them. Mrs. That is, the Whitfield property, you say? Yes, Eleanor said. She'd dressed carefully that morning, the better of her two respectable dresses, her hair pinned with particular attention, her boots, despite the cracked heel, because they were the more authoritative-looking pair. She'd thought of it in those terms, actually. Which boots say, I know what I'm doing. I'd like to see the original deed and any associated legal documents. I'm assisting with the estate. Are you legally? What is your relationship to the estate? I was contracted to marry Gerald Whitfield, she said, which was true, more or less. He died before I arrived. The estate is in a period of resolution, and I'm helping to organize the records. She said it in the tone her father had used when talking to people who doubted whether he should be trusted with something, which was a tone of patient certainty that didn't acknowledge the doubt at all. Bricker brought her the documents. She sat at a table in the corner of the land office and read them carefully, which took most of the morning. Rhett had dropped her off in town and gone to the feed store with instructions to collect her at noon. The deed was straightforward. Gerald Whitfield had purchased the property 18 years ago. The legal description was clear. The boundaries were clear. What was less clear was a document filed 8 months ago, a preliminary claim notice filed by the Harlan Cattle Company asserting a right of first refusal on the Whitfield property in the event of sale or foreclosure, on the basis of a grazing easement that had supposedly been agreed to verbally between Victor Harlan and Gerald Whitfield 2 years prior. Eleanor read the clause 3 times. She asked Bricker for the full file on the easement claim. Bricker looked uncomfortable. It's an active filing. I'm not sure if... It's a public record, she said, still in the patient tone. Land office filings are public record. Bricker brought her the file. There was no written easement agreement. The preliminary claim cited the verbal agreement as its basis and referenced a witness, a man named Dale Pruitt, whom she would later discover was the nephew of the woman who ran the boarding house and who worked as a hand on Harlan's property. She wrote down everything carefully in the small notebook she'd brought. When Rhett came to collect her at noon, she was standing outside the land office in the cold, notebook in hand, and she didn't wait for him to ask. He doesn't own the grazing rights, she said. He filed a claim based on a verbal agreement with no written record, witnessed by his own employee. It's not legal, it's a placeholder. He's been waiting to see if anyone would challenge it. Rhett had his hands in his coat pockets. And if no one challenges it, if the property goes to foreclosure and no one's looking carefully, he could argue the claim gives him priority. It's shaky. A good lawyer would knock it over in an afternoon, but a good lawyer costs money, and if the estate looks like it can't manage the debt he manufactured, he doesn't need to win the legal fight. He just needs everyone to look at the numbers and give up. Rhett said it slowly, like he was hearing the shape of it for the first time. Yes. She got into the wagon. We need to find someone who knew about Gerald Whitfield's actual finances. not the ledger. Someone who was with him when he was handling money, a banker maybe, or someone who witnessed transactions. There's a man in Tulsa who handled some of Mr. Whitfield's cattle contracts, Rhett said. A broker named Alderman. Mr. Whitfield mentioned him a few times. Can we reach him by letter? Faster by telegraph. Then let's send one this afternoon. Dora Flagg watched Eleanor with something between suspicion and cautious approval, which Eleanor found more useful than either pure suspicion or outright welcome. Dora was a practical woman, and practical women tended to judge people by what they did rather than what they said, which suited Eleanor fine. On the third evening, while Eleanor was at the kitchen table going over the notes she'd made at the land office, Dora set a cup of coffee down beside her without being asked, and then stood there for a moment longer than a cup of coffee required. People in town are talking, Dora said. About me? About you being here. About whether you have any right to be. She paused. Victor Harlan's had 2 men ask around about you. Who you are, where you came from. Eleanor kept her eyes on her notes. And what did people tell them? Not much. People around here don't generally help Harlan when they can avoid it. They're scared of him, but scared and willing are different things. Another pause. He came to the funeral, you know, Mr. Whitfield's, stood right up front, very solemn, very concerned, said what a tragedy it was. I imagine he thought it was very convenient. I imagine he did. Dora refilled her own coffee and sat down across the table, which was the first time she'd sat down in Eleanor's presence. That Callahan boy is a good worker, she said. Hard to tell what he's thinking half the time. But he's not dishonest. I've known dishonest men, and he's not one of them. I know, Eleanor said. You just met him 3 days ago. I know that too. She looked up. Some things you can tell. Dora made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been skepticism. It occupied that exact middle territory between the two. Well, she said, if you're planning to do something about all of this, she gestured at the notebooks and ledgers spread across the table. You should know that Harlan's got at least 2 men on the town council in his pocket, and the county judge is, well, let's say the judge has done business with him. Who hasn't? The new circuit judge out of Guthrie, Dora said. He came through 6 months ago. Harlan tried to approach him at a dinner and got a very cold reception, from what I heard. Territorial government's been trying to clean up some of the county corruption. It's slow going, but it's going. Eleanor looked at her. How do you know all of this? Dora picked up her coffee cup. I've been in this county for 30 years, she said. People don't notice when a woman's listening. Eleanor thought about that for a moment. I'm going to need your help, she said. I figured you might, Dora said. That's why I'm sitting here. The response from the broker in Tulsa came 4 days later, longer than she'd hoped, but faster than she'd feared. It confirmed that Gerald Whitfield had, through his account with the Alderman brokerage, maintained a positive balance from cattle sales through the previous summer. Specific figures that did not align with the debt picture painted by the altered ledger. More importantly, Alderman included a reference to a formal sale of 40 head of Whitfield cattle that had taken place in September, the proceeds of which, $260, should have appeared in the ranch accounts. They did not appear in the ranch accounts. That's where the money went, Eleanor said. She was sitting on the porch steps despite the cold, because she'd been inside with the papers all morning and needed air, and Rhett was standing in the yard with a fence post in one hand because he'd been in the middle of repairs when she'd come out to find him. Harlan's man altered the withdrawal entry so it looks like an operating expense, and the deposit from the cattle sale. It either never reached the account at all, or there's a second set of books somewhere that shows where it actually went. He took money directly from the cattle sales. Or redirected them. It would have taken someone inside the sale process, or someone who could intercept the payment before it reached the account. She looked at her notebook. Who handled the cattle transport to the sale in September? Rhett set the fence post down against the rail. Harlan's men, he said. Mr. Whitfield used Harlan's drovers for the fall transport. It was a contracted arrangement, been going on for years. He paused. He trusted Harlan that much? He trusted a contract, she said, which is different. And Harlan knew exactly how much the cattle were worth. $260 and access to the books, Rhett said slowly. He built the debt himself. Over 2 years. Probably more gradually than that, small amounts, staying under what would raise immediate alarm. She closed the notebook. We need the original bank statements from Whitfield's account going back 3 years, if there are any, and the transport contracts. Bank statements would be at First Territorial in Guthrie. I know. She stood up. We're going to need to go to Guthrie. Rhett looked at her. That's a full day's ride. I'm aware. I also think we need to see a lawyer while we're there. Not a Red Hollow lawyer. That costs money. We have $31. She paused. And the deed to a ranch that Harlan himself apparently thinks is worth stealing. If I can find a lawyer willing to work against contingency, I think we have something worth bringing to them. The wind came across the yard and pushed her hair sideways. She caught it with one hand and pushed it back under her hat, which had never quite fit right since the train. Rhett picked the fence post back up and looked at it as if conducting some private negotiation with the wood. I'll get the wagon ready for the morning, he said. She nodded. Thank you. Miss Whitmore. He said it without looking up. For what it's worth, what you found in those ledgers. I've been watching this place slowly get worse for 2 years, and I didn't see it. I didn't put it together. You weren't looking at the books. I should have been. You were doing your job, she said. You can't do everything. She turned to go back inside. We'll leave at first light. She went up to the study and sat down at Gerald Whitfield's desk and looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece to a different angle from the one downstairs, this one taken from the side, and she could see that he had, in fact, been smiling, just not at the camera. She thought about what kind of man spends 18 years building something and never realizes someone's been quietly dismantling it from underneath him. She thought about the careful handwriting in those ledger entries, the forged ones with the European sevens, the deliberateness of it, the patience. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing down everything she knew, in order, with the amounts and the dates and the names, because a thing written down was harder to argue with than a thing remembered, and she was going to need to argue with quite a few things before this was finished. Outside, the wind pushed against the boarded window again. She didn't look up from the page. The road to Guthrie was exactly as bad as Rhett had implied, and possibly worse. It had rained 2 days before, which meant the wagon wheels found every soft spot in the earth and committed to it fully. And Eleanor spent the first hour of the journey gripping the bench with one hand and her notebook with the other, while Rhett navigated around ruts that could have swallowed the front axle whole. She didn't complain about it. Complaining about roads didn't fix roads, and she needed the mental space for other things. Tell me about Harlan, she said, once they'd cleared the worst stretch and the ground had hardened again into something more cooperative. Not what he's done to the ranch, what he's like. Rhett was quiet for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize as thinking rather than reluctance. 60, maybe 62. Came out here about 25 years ago with money from somewhere back east. Nobody's ever been entirely clear on where. Started buying land when it was cheap, which was smart, and then started buying the people who managed the land, which was smarter, at least in terms of how he operates. He adjusted the reins. He's not loud about it. That's the thing people don't always understand. He doesn't come in shouting and throwing his weight around. He's polite. He shows up to funerals and harvest dinners, and he knows everybody's children's names. He makes it very hard to point at him and say that man is the problem because on the surface he looks like exactly the opposite. Mapam yishatan. The surface is the point, Eleanor said. If the surface looks good enough, most people won't look underneath. Most people don't want the trouble of looking underneath. No. She looked at the flat land going by. Has anyone ever challenged him directly? A homesteader named Reeves about 4 years ago. Harlan claimed a water rights dispute on the man's property. Reeves fought it. He lost. The county judge ruled against him, which, as you know. The judge does business with Harlan. Reeves left the territory 6 months later, sold for half what the land was worth. He paused. There was talk, but talk's cheap. What kind of talk? The kind where people say they think someone put pressure on Reeves in ways that weren't legal. Nobody could prove it. Nobody tried very hard to prove it. Eleanor filed that away. And the railroad, she said. Rhett glanced at her. What do you know about the railroad? Nothing specific. But Harlan's not stupid, and he's not patient for no reason. He's been working this scheme on the Whitfield property for 2 years at minimum, which means he's waiting for something. Something that makes the land more valuable than it currently appears. She turned to look at him. Is there talk of a railroad coming through this part of the territory? Rhett was quiet in a different way this time. Not thinking, more like deciding. There was talk, he said finally. A year and a half ago. Something about a spur line that the Continental Pacific was considering to connect the cattle shipment routes in the western part of the territory. It never got confirmed officially. The talk died down. Talk dies down because people stop talking about it, she said. It doesn't mean the thing stopped being planned. She opened her notebook. If a rail line came through the southern edge of this county, what land would it cross? He said nothing for a long moment. The Whitfield North pasture, he said. She wrote it down. And the stretch of grazing land on the west boundary, he continued, slower. The one he's been pushing Mr. Whitfield to sell for 2 years, called it overgrazed, not worth maintaining, offered 60 cents on the dollar. He stopped. Mr. Whitfield wouldn't sell it. Harlan offered 3 times over 2 years, and Mr. Whitfield said no every time. Because Whitfield knew it was worth more. Or just because he didn't want to sell to Harlan. Either way, she tapped her pen on the page. We need to find out if there's a formal filing for that railroad anywhere in the territorial records. And we need to find out before Harlan knows we're looking. The wagon went on. A hawk circled something in the middle distance, patient and unhurried, and Eleanor watched it until it dropped out of sight below the ridgeline. Guthrie was a real town, which Eleanor appreciated more than she'd expected to after a week in Red Hollow. It had paved streets in the central quarter, a proper courthouse, a telegraph office, 2 banks, and a hotel with a dining room that served actual food as opposed to the approximate idea of food that the station in Red Hollow had offered when she'd first arrived. They arrived early enough in the afternoon that she could make 2 stops before anything closed. The first was First Territorial Bank, where she asked, calmly, with the same patient certainty she'd used at the land office, to speak with the branch manager about the Whitfield account. She explained her position with the same careful wording she'd used before. Assisting with a state organization, contracted to the deceased, attempting to reconcile records. The branch manager, a man named Holst, who wore a very clean vest and had the careful manner of someone who dealt with uncertainty by being extremely precise about small things, reviewed the account history with visible reluctance and eventual grudging thoroughness. The deposits from September's cattle sale were not in the account. There's no record of a deposit in that amount during September, Holst said, running his finger down the ledger. The last significant deposit was in July, $140 from what appears to be a quarterly payment. The cattle transport in September was handled by Harlan Cattle Company drovers, Eleanor said. Is there any record of a transfer or redirection from this account to a Harlan account? Holst looked at her over his glasses. I'm not in a position to share information about other accounts. I understand. But if money from this account was moved without the account holder's instruction, that would be a matter of fraud. It would, he said carefully, be a matter for the courts to determine. Yes, she agreed. It would. Thank you for your time. She made notes on the sidewalk outside quickly, while Rhett stood beside her with his hat in his hands. You think they moved the money through a second account, he said. I think they collected the cattle sale proceeds and deposited them somewhere that wasn't the Whitfield account, which would require someone at the brokerage level or someone who intercepted the payment before it was processed. Alderman's letter said the sale was completed and payment issued. If it was issued and never deposited, she tucked the notebook under her arm. Second stop. The lawyer's name was Cora Standish, which was not what Eleanor had expected. She'd asked at the hotel for a recommendation for a territorial attorney with experience in land and fraud cases, and the woman behind the desk had written down a name and address without hesitation. The office was on a side street, up a narrow staircase, with a door that had C. Standish, attorney at law, painted on the glass in careful letters. Eleanor knocked. Come in. Cora Standish was perhaps 45, with dark red hair gone partly gray, and an expression of professional neutrality that Eleanor suspected could shift very quickly in either direction. Her desk was stacked with papers in a way that looked disorganized until you looked more closely and realized it was actually a specific kind of order that she'd developed and anyone else would have to learn. Sit down, she said. You're not from Guthrie. Red Hollow, Eleanor said, sitting. Rhett had stayed in the waiting area outside because the office was small, and also because he'd said, with characteristic directness, You're better at talking to people than I am, so you should do it. What's the situation? Eleanor laid it out. She was brief and specific. The manufactured debt, the altered ledgers, the missing cattle sale proceeds, the preliminary easement claim with its dubious basis, and the probable connection to a railroad route. She laid her notebook on the desk and turned it so Standish could read the figures. Standish read in silence for 2 minutes, which felt longer. Victor Harlan, she said finally. Yes, I know him by reputation. She turned the notebook back. You have physical evidence? The ledgers with the altered entries? Yes, and we have a letter from the broker in Tulsa confirming the cattle sale and the payment issued. Who received the payment? The broker says it was collected by a representative of Harlan Cattle Company, which was the transport contractor. The representative would have had authorization to receive payment on behalf of Whitfield for the purposes of the transport contract, but the contract wouldn't have authorized redirecting the funds away from the Whitfield account. Standish picked up a pen and turned it over in her fingers, which seemed to be how she thought. The easement claim is weak. I've seen similar filings. It's a placeholder, as you suspected. If someone challenges it with standing, it falls apart. The fraud case is more complex. You need to establish chain of custody on the money, which means getting into Harlan's accounts, which requires a court order, which requires a judge who isn't in his pocket. She looked up. You know about the county judge. I know. The circuit judge out of this district is a different matter, Judge Meredith. He's been on the bench 8 months, and he's not particularly impressed with old arrangements. She set the pen down. I'll be honest with you about what this looks like. You're a woman with no formal legal standing on this property. The estate goes to Whitfield's family unless his will specifies otherwise, and you said there's a sister in Tennessee who hasn't responded. Yes. If the sister responds and claims the estate, you have no case to bring. I know that too, but... Standish's expression shifted slightly. If the estate is in legal limbo, which it currently is, there's an argument that as the contracted party, the person Whitfield invited specifically to manage his household, and eventually the property, you have an interest in ensuring the estate is protected from fraudulent claims while the inheritance is resolved. It's not a strong argument in itself, but combined with the evidence of fraud, it gives us a door. What kind of door? An emergency injunction to freeze any foreclosure proceedings against the property while the fraud claim is investigated. It doesn't win you the ranch, but it stops Harlan from taking it while we build the actual case. She paused. My fee for initial work is $40. Eleanor kept her expression even. I have 31. Standish looked at her for a moment. Contingency, she said. If the fraud is established and money is recovered, I take 20% of recovered funds. If nothing is recovered, you owe me nothing additional. Why? The question seemed to surprise Standish slightly. Why what? Why contingency? You don't know me. You don't know if this case can be won. Standish picked up the pen again. I know Victor Harlan's reputation. I know the county judge's reputation. And I know that women who walk into my office with ledgers and specific numbers and evidence they gathered themselves in a week are considerably more likely to see a case through than people who come here because they're angry and want someone else to solve it for them. She set the pen down again. Also, I've been trying to find a clean fraud case against Harlan for 3 years. People know what he does, but knowing and proving are different things. You might have given me the proving. Bo pesquisquimose. Eleanor extended her hand across the desk. Then we have an agreement. They stayed the night in Guthrie because Rhett had determined correctly that doing the return trip in the dark was the kind of decision that ended with a broken wagon axle on an unlit road, and Eleanor had agreed because she was tired in a way that went deeper than one night's sleep could fix, but that even 6 hours would help. The hotel had 2 rooms. Rhett paid for his own, and Eleanor didn't argue about it because she'd figured out by now that arguing with him about money was like arguing with the fence posts. They just stood there and waited for you to stop. She ate dinner alone in the dining room. Real food, a proper stew with actual vegetables, bread that hadn't been sitting since morning, and sat with her notebook afterward, going over the list. The railroad was the key. She felt certain of that. Harlan hadn't manufactured 2 years of debt and an easement claim and a fake cattle sale redirection just for a struggling cattle ranch. The ranch wasn't worth that much trouble on its own. Land that a railroad needed to cross, land in a territory where the cattle industry was desperate for faster shipping routes. That was a different calculation entirely. That was worth any amount of trouble. She needed the railroad records. She needed to find the survey routes, the preliminary filings, something that put the Continental Pacific line directly through the Whitfield North pasture. She was still writing when she heard the chair across from her move. She looked up. The man who sat down across from her was not someone she recognized. He was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with a neat beard and the kind of clothes that were expensive without being showy. He smiled at her with the particular warmth of someone who had decided in advance what this conversation was going to be. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She kept her face still. "You have the advantage of me. My name is Carver. I work for Mr. Harlan." He said it pleasantly, as if it were a recommendation. He wanted me to convey his sympathies about Gerald Whitfield. A real loss. Gerald was a difficult man to know, but a decent one. "That's a kind thing to say," Eleanor said, in a tone that said nothing at all. "Mr. Harlan also wanted me to pass along that if you're in any difficulty, given the circumstances being stranded so far from home, he'd be happy to facilitate a comfortable return to wherever you've come from. There's a morning train east. He'd be glad to purchase your ticket." "That's very generous." He's a generous man. Carver folded his hands on the table. He's also a practical man. He understands that the situation with the Whitfield property is complicated, legally speaking, and he'd hate for you to find yourself entangled in a complicated legal situation so far from home. Eleanor closed her notebook. She set her pen down on top of it. She looked at Carver with the specific calm of someone who has already decided not to be afraid of this. "Tell Mr. Harlan," she said, "that I appreciate his concern, and tell him that I'm quite comfortable where I am." A beat. "Is that the message?" "That's the message." Carver looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. The smile still in place, but something else behind it. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and nodded once. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." He left. She watched him go. She sat very still for a moment, then picked up her pen and wrote at the bottom of the page, "Harlan knows I'm in Guthrie. He knows my name. He has someone watching." She told Red at breakfast. He listened without speaking, with the particular quality of attention he had that she'd come to notice, fully present, not planning what to say next, just taking in the information. "He's trying to scare you off," he said when she finished. "Yes." "Did it work?" She poured her coffee. "No, but it tells us something." "What's that?" "He's worried enough to send someone. If he thought this was going to resolve itself the way he planned, if he thought I was just a woman who'd take stock of things and leave, he wouldn't bother." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He knows we've been looking at the accounts. Either Bricker at the land office told someone, or Holst at the bank, or someone saw us at Standish's office." She paused. "Or all three. Red Hollow's got a long memory and a short telegraph line," Rhett said. "Yes." She set the cup down. "We need to move faster than he is. The injunction filing, Standish said she'd have it ready within a week, but the railroad survey records—" She looked at him. "You said the talk about the Continental Pacific died down. Was there anyone specific who was talking about it? Anyone who might have more information than general gossip?" Rhett thought. "There was a surveyor who came through Red Hollow about 14 months ago. Stayed at Pruitt's boarding house for a week. I don't know who he was working for, but surveyors don't come through nowhere for no reason." "Pruitt's boarding house," she repeated. "Mrs. Pruitt, who had sent the bread. Does Mrs. Pruitt keep records? Guest registers?" "She's the kind of woman who writes down everything," he said. "She's been running that boarding house for 20 years. She probably has every name, every date, every room charge going back to the beginning." Eleanor stood up from the table. "Then we should visit Mrs. Pruitt when we get back." The drive back to Red Hollow was easier than the drive out, partly because the road had dried further, and partly because Eleanor had learned to brace differently on the wagon bench. She'd also, somewhere in the last 24 hours, stopped feeling like a visitor in the landscape. The flat red earth, and the pale winter sky, and the fence lines running to the horizon. She'd stopped seeing them as alien and started seeing them as information. What they meant about the weather, what the cattle in this pasture versus that one suggested about the grazing quality. what the condition of the fence line said about who'd been maintaining them and who hadn't. She noticed things. She had always noticed things. She just hadn't always had the opportunity to notice things that mattered. "Can I ask you something?" Rhett said, somewhere around mile 8. "Yes." "Why didn't you go back when you found out? At the station?" He was watching the road. "Most women would have. Most women with options would have," she said. "I had $31 and a return ticket. That's not nothing, but it's also not. I don't have family in Ohio that I'm eager to return to. My mother's been remarried for 2 years to a man who is fine, but not particularly interested in having a 23-year-old stepdaughter taking up space." She paused. "And I'd been corresponding with Gerald Whitfield for 4 months. I'd been thinking about this place for 4 months. You build a picture in your head, and then someone tells you the picture is wrong, and the question is whether you put it away or whether you try to understand what the actual picture looks like. And what does the actual picture look like?" She considered that. "Like a lot of work," she said, "and a problem that can be solved if someone bothers to solve it." "It's not your problem to solve." "It is now," she said. "I made it mine." He didn't say anything to that, but she noticed that his jaw did the thing again, that small, settling motion, and she'd come to understand that this was what it looked like when Rhett Callahan had decided something. Mrs. Pruitt ran her boarding house with the systematic attention of someone who had long ago determined that looseness of record-keeping was the enemy of a comfortable life. She was a woman of 60-odd years with the kind of energy that suggested 60 was only a number she'd been assigned, and not one she particularly agreed with. She remembered the surveyor. "November before last," she said, sitting across from Eleanor in the boarding house parlor with the leather-bound register open on her knee. "Here he is, F. Langdon. Stayed 7 nights, paid in full, no trouble." She turned the book so Eleanor could see the entry. F. Langdon, arriving November 12th, professional business, departing November 19th. "Did he say who he was working for?" Mrs. Pruitt's expression was thoughtful, in the way of someone replaying a conversation. "He didn't say exactly, but he had equipment. Measuring equipment. I know what that looks like. My first husband was a civil engineer, and he had papers with him, maps. I could see the edges of them when he came down for breakfast. He asked about the land to the south and east. Who owned what? How far the parcels ran?" She paused. "He asked specifically about the Whitfield North pasture. Whether it was good land, whether Mr. Whitfield was likely to sell. What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't speculate about my neighbor's business decisions," she said, with a precision that suggested she had speculated extensively and simply not to the surveyor. "But he asked around town. He talked to people at the feed store, and—" She stopped. "And?" "And I saw him have dinner with Victor Harlan on his 5th night here," she said, "at Harlan's own house. One of Harlan's men came to collect him. They were gone 2 hours. Eleanor wrote that down. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said, "I know this is an unusual question, but would you be willing to write down what you've told me? Not for a court, just for our records. A signed statement of what you observed." The older woman looked at her steadily. "Are you going after Harlan?" "I'm going after what he did to this property." "That's the same thing." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I suppose it is." Mrs. Pruitt closed the register and set it on the side table and folded her hands in her lap. "Gerald Whitfield was a difficult man," she said. "He wasn't easy to know. He didn't come into town much, didn't socialize, people thought he was unfriendly, but he never cheated anyone, and he never pretended to be something he wasn't, and in my experience those two things are rarer than they sound." She looked at Eleanor. "Dale Pruitt is my nephew, the one Harlan used as a witness for the easement claim." Seeing. Eleanor kept very still. "Dale is not a bad boy," Mrs. Pruitt said quietly. "He's young, and he needed work, and Harlan offered it. And when Harlan asked him to sign a paper saying he'd witnessed a conversation, Dale probably didn't think too hard about what he was signing or what it meant." She picked up the register again. "But I know my nephew, and I know he didn't actually witness any agreement between Harlan and Mr. Whitfield, because if he had, he'd have told me. He tells me everything, whether I want to hear it or not." Eleanor said carefully, "Would Dale be willing to say that?" "He'd be scared to," Mrs. Pruitt said. He'd be very scared. But if someone sat down with him and explained what he'd actually signed and what it could mean for him legally, a false witness statement is a serious matter. I think he might choose being scared over being in legal trouble. She paused. I could talk to him first. I'd appreciate that very much. I'll write your statement, Mrs. Pruitt said, rising. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning. Okay. The days that followed had a particular quality that Eleanor would later struggle to describe. Not routine exactly, because none of it was routine, but rhythm. They had a shape now. She and Rhett worked from first light until the evenings became too dark for paperwork, and the work divided itself between the physical and the administrative in a way that turned out to suit both of them without either of them having to say so directly. Rhett kept the ranch running. There were 3 ranch hands who'd stayed on after Whitfield's death, 2 brothers named Park, and one older man called Sorensen, who had the weathered patience of a man who'd seen everything and was not particularly surprised by any of it. Rhett managed them with the same low-key reliability with which he did everything, and the cattle were fed and the fences were maintained and the equipment didn't break down any more than equipment was going to break down anyway. Eleanor managed the accounts, and the correspondence and the evidence, which had grown from a stack of ledgers into something that required its own corner of the study. Standish had sent word that the injunction filing was proceeding, and that Judge Meredith had agreed to hear it within 2 weeks. The injunction wouldn't establish anything permanently, but it would stop the foreclosure clock. What they needed now was the railroad survey. Tell me more about Langdon, Eleanor said one evening. She and Rhett were sitting at the kitchen table after supper because the study was cold and the kitchen had a fire going. Dora had gone to bed an hour ago. The wind outside was doing what the wind out here always did, which was assert itself. If he was in Red Hollow 14 months ago and he was surveying for the Continental Pacific, we don't know it was Continental Pacific. No. But if it was any railroad, there would be a formal filing at some point. Survey work doesn't happen in secret. The company has to file right-of-way applications with the territorial government. She had her notebook open. I wrote to the Territorial Land Commission in Oklahoma City 3 days ago, asked for any pending or recent right-of-way filings for rail lines in this county. Rhett looked at her. Will they answer? It's public record. They have to. She turned the pen over. The question is whether the answer gets here before Harlan figures out we're asking. He already knows you're asking things. He knows I'm looking at the accounts. He doesn't necessarily know I've connected the railroad to the land value. She paused. Although if his surveyor spent 5 days in Red Hollow asking about land ownership, Harlan knows I could make that connection. So he's waiting to see how far you get. Or he's not waiting at all, she said, and I just haven't seen what he's doing yet. That thought sat between them for a moment. Rhett turned his coffee cup on the table, a small rotating motion, watching it. There are things that have been happening on the ranch that I haven't been able to explain, he said. What things? A fence line on the west boundary went down last week. I thought weather, but the posts weren't pulled loose. They were cut. Clean cuts, not a break. He was still watching the cup. And Sorensen found tracks on the north pasture last Tuesday. Horses, 3 or 4 of them, coming in from the south road at night. They weren't ours. Eleanor looked at him. Someone's been on the property. Looks that way. Looking for what? I don't know. Maybe just looking, taking stock. He finally stopped rotating the cup. Or marking it. She thought about that. Survey stakes, maybe. Men coming onto the property to mark boundaries that Harlan intended to claim before any official transfer had happened. We need to walk the north pasture, she said. The whole perimeter. Are you free tomorrow morning? I'm free when it's needed. Tomorrow morning, then. She closed the notebook. Bring the Park brothers. So... They found the survey stakes the next morning. Not many, 4, driven into the ground at intervals along the north pasture boundary, wooden stakes with red cloth tied to the top, the kind used to mark planned routes, the kind a surveyor would use. Rhett pulled one out of the ground and turned it in his hands. The wood was weathered, but not old. A month, maybe 6 weeks. He's already marked it, Eleanor said. Before the property is even resolved, Rhett said. Before the estate is settled. He looked at the stake. He's not even waiting. He thinks it's done, she said. He thinks the debt looks too big, the estate is too confused, and the woman who showed up asking questions will take the morning train and go back to Ohio. She took the stake from his hands. We need to document where these are. Exact positions. I want to be able to show that Harlan placed survey markers on private property before any legal transfer had occurred. They went around the north pasture perimeter, all of it, 2 miles in cold that pressed in from the north with its full weight. And Eleanor wrote down every stake they found. 8 total. Each one documented with a written description of its position. Park the elder, who was perhaps 25 and spoke less than his younger brother, looked at the stakes and looked at Eleanor and said, "You gonna get him?" "I'm gonna try," she said. "Mr. Whitfield was straight with us," he said. It was perhaps the longest sentence she'd heard from him. Paid on time, never shorted us, told us the truth about what he needed. You don't find that every time. He looked out across the pasture. "So, we'll help, however." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and went back to his work. And Eleanor stood for a moment with her notebook and looked out over the flat winter pasture, the pale grass and the red earth and the sky doing its enormous, indifferent thing overhead, and thought, this is the place, right here. This is what it comes down to. 8 stakes in the ground and a man who thinks he's already won. She pulled the red cloth off the stake she was still holding and put it in her pocket. Then she walked back to the house to write another letter. The letter from the Territorial Land Commission arrived 9 days after she'd sent hers, in a thick envelope that meant the answer was either complicated or thorough, and she tore it open at the kitchen table with Rhett standing behind her and Dora pretending not to be watching from the doorway. The Continental Pacific Railroad had filed a preliminary right-of-way application 14 months ago for a spur line connecting the Western Territory cattle routes to the main line at Stillwater. The route, as surveyed by 1F Langdon on behalf of the company, crossed multiple parcels in Red Hollow County, including Eleanor's finger found the line and stopped there. The north pasture of the Whitfield property, approximately 0.4 miles in length, and the western grazing boundary of the same property, approximately 0.7 miles. The filing had been made under a shell company name, not Continental Pacific directly, a company called Western Territory Land Associates, which would require more digging to trace back to the railroad, but the survey description matched Langdon's work, and the timing matched exactly. "That's it," Rhett said quietly. He was close enough that she could feel the stillness in him, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was looking at something important and taking its full measure. "That's it," she agreed. 1.1 miles of rail right-of-way crossing the 2 parcels Harlan's been trying to acquire for 2 years. And if he can file a foreclosure claim on the property before anyone establishes that the land value is actually, he buys it for debt settlement value, Rhett said, which is pennies on the dollar compared to what a railroad right-of-way is worth. He could sell the right-of-way alone for more than he's paid for the entire ranch. She set the letter down. "This is why. This is the whole reason." Dora had stopped pretending not to watch. She was simply watching now with an expression of dark, satisfied attention. "I'm taking this to Standish," Eleanor said, along with the survey stakes, the Pruitt statement, the alderman letter, and everything else. She looked up. "Rhett, I need you to write down everything you know. Everything you've observed on this property over the last 2 years. The altered records, the transport contractor, the stakes, everything. I know you're not a writing man, but I need your account." "I can write," he said somewhat sharply. She didn't smile, but it was close. "Good. Then write." "When?" "Start tonight," she said. "We don't have a lot of time left before Harlan figures out where we are." He looked at her for a moment. A long look, the kind he gave things when he was deciding whether to say what he was thinking. "You know," he said, "when I went to that station to tell you about Mr. Whitfield, I thought I was going to spend 20 minutes with a woman from Ohio and then put her on the next train west. I know. I thought the whole thing was going to be over in a day." He picked up his hat from the table. "Seems like it's not." "It seems like it's not," she agreed. He put the hat on and went to the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Miss Whitmore," he said it without turning around. "For what it's worth, the way you put this together, what you found in those ledgers, and the land office, and the commission filing," he stopped. "Mr. Whitfield would have wanted someone like you here. I think he'd have been glad you stayed." She said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't have sounded too easy. After he left, Dor came out of the doorway properly and sat down at the table and looked at the letter and the notebook and the spread of evidence that covered most of the surface. "He doesn't say things like that very often," Dora observed. "I know," Eleanor said, "so you should probably take it seriously." "I do," she said, and turned back to the letter and wrote the next thing on the list. Standish's response to the commission filing came faster than Eleanor expected. A telegram, not a letter, which meant the attorney considered it urgent enough not to wait for the post. Railroad filing confirmed. Shell Company traced to Continental Pacific subsidiary. Filing date precedes Harlan's easement claim by 6 weeks. Come to Guthrie at earliest convenience. Bring all physical evidence. Standish. Eleanor read it twice, folded it, and put it in her notebook between the Land Commission letter and the page of survey stake positions. 6 weeks. Harlan had known about the railroad filing 6 weeks before he placed his preliminary easement claim on the Whitfield property, which meant the claim wasn't opportunistic, it was designed. He'd seen the filing, understood what it meant for the land value, and immediately begun constructing his legal position to intercept it. She went to find Rhett. He was in the barn working on a piece of harness that had cracked at the buckle, sitting on an upturned crate with the leather across his knees and a look of focused irritation that suggested the buckle was not cooperating. "We need to go to Guthrie again," she said. He looked up. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. I need one more thing first." "What thing?" "Dale Pruitt." Mrs. Pruitt had spoken to her nephew, as she'd said she would. Dale Pruitt turned out to be 20 years old, with the uncomfortable bearing of someone who has recently realized that a thing they did without thinking much about it has become considerably more serious than they'd understood at the time. He came to the Whitfield ranch in the late afternoon, brought by his aunt in her wagon, and sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and didn't quite meet Eleanor's eyes when she came in. "Mrs. Pruitt told you why I wanted to speak with you," Eleanor said, sitting across from him. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was younger than his face. "I'm not here to get you in trouble, Dale. I want you to understand that." "Yes, ma'am. But I need you to tell me honestly what you actually saw. Not what you signed, what you actually witnessed." He turned his hat over once. "Mr. Carver, Harlan's man, he came to where I was working about 8 months ago. Said he needed a witness for a document. Said it was just a formality, that I'd seen things I hadn't necessarily paid attention to at the time." He paused. "I didn't know what I was signing exactly. He said it was an easement confirmation. I thought that was some kind of, I don't know. I thought it was routine. Did you ever witness a conversation between Victor Harlan and Gerald Whitfield about grazing rights?" "No, ma'am." He said it quietly, but clearly. "I saw them speak at a harvest social 2 years back. They didn't look friendly. I don't know what they said." "That's what I needed to know." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is a written account of what you just told me. If you sign it, it becomes a statement that contradicts the easement filing. It could be used in court." He looked at the paper. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and a horse in the paddock made a sound about it. "What happens to me if I sign?" he asked. "Nothing should," she said. "You were misled about what you were signing. That's on Carver and Harlan, not on you. If you come forward and correct it voluntarily, a court is going to look at you very differently than if it comes out another way. And if Harlan finds out I signed," she didn't minimize it. "He might be angry. He might let it go because fighting over the witness is more trouble than it's worth. I don't know which." She kept her eyes on him. "But I think you know that what you signed wasn't right, and I think that's been sitting with you." He looked at his aunt, who was standing near the stove and had been quiet through the whole conversation, with the stillness of a woman who had already said what she needed to say in private and was now simply being present. Mrs. Pruitt nodded once, small. Dale Pruitt picked up the pen. They made the Guthrie trip in better weather than the first time, which helped, though Eleanor barely noticed the weather because she spent most of the journey going over documents in her lap, reading lines she'd read a dozen times already, checking that the sequence was right, that the evidence told the story in the order it needed to be told. Rhett drove and didn't say much, which she appreciated. At some point around mile 15, he reached into his coat pocket and produced 2 pieces of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and held one out without comment, and she took it without comment, and they ate in companionable silence while the land went by. It was, she realized, the most comfortable she'd felt since Ohio, which was a strange thing to realize, and she filed it away without examining it too closely. Standish met them in her office with the manner of someone who had been thinking hard for several days and was ready to share the results. "Sit down," she said to both of them, which was also new. She'd told Rhett to wait outside the first time. She either didn't have that concern now, or she'd made a decision about his involvement. "I've been in contact with the Continental Pacific's regional representative, informally, through a colleague. They're aware that there's a competing interest claim on the right-of-way parcels." "Harlan's easement," Eleanor said. "Yes. And here's what's interesting. The railroad is not pleased about it. They have no interest in purchasing land that's encumbered by disputed claims. They want clean title, clean right-of-way, and they want it resolved before they formalize the road." Standish sat back. If Harlan's easement claim holds up, the railroad has to negotiate with him for right-of-way access, which would give him enormous leverage. If it's invalidated, they deal directly with the property owner, Eleanor said, at significantly more favorable terms from the property's perspective. The right-of-way payment for 1.1 miles of rail crossing is, in the current market, somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. Rhett, who had been quiet since they sat down, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Eleanor kept her face still, but she felt it. The particular sensation of a number that changes the shape of everything around it. $4,000 to $6,000 against a manufactured debt of $940. The ranch wasn't just salvageable. If the fraud was established and the right-of-way was negotiated properly, it was profitable. "Harlan knew this," she said. "Without question," Standish said. "He's been positioning himself to intercept that payment from the beginning. The fake debt brings the property to foreclosure, his easement claim gives him right-of-way rights, and he sells to the railroad for a premium while the Whitfield estate gets nothing." She tapped the desk. "Now, what have you brought me?" Eleanor opened the document case she'd assembled and laid everything out in order. The ledgers with the altered entries, her written analysis of the discrepancy, the alderman letter, the land commission filing and its connection to the shell company, the survey stake documentation with positions and dates, Mrs. Pruitt's signed statement about the surveyor Langdon and his dinner with Harlan, and Dale Pruitt's statement retracting his witness to the easement agreement. Standish went through it methodically, reading each item with the focused attention of someone cataloging evidence rather than simply reading. She made occasional notes in the margin of her own pad. She asked 2 questions, one about the chain of custody on the ledgers, one about the timeline of the survey stakes, and Eleanor answered both. When she finished, she set her pen down and looked at Eleanor with something that wasn't quite surprise but was in that neighborhood. "This is more than I expected," she said. "Is it enough?" "It's enough to request a full fraud investigation from the territorial court. It's enough to invalidate the easement claim, almost certainly. The manufactured debt will be harder, establishing that the ledger alterations were Harlan's doing rather than Whitfield's own accounting errors, requires testimony about who had access to those books and when." She paused. "The Pruitt statement helps, but we need either Carver directly or someone from the brokerage side who can speak to the cattle sale payment." "Alderman is in Tulsa," Eleanor said. "I've been corresponding with him. He's aware of the discrepancy and he's not happy about it. His brokerage handled the transaction, and if money moved through his system in a way that bypassed the client account, his professional standing is at risk." "Would he testify?" "I think if he's approached by a court rather than by me, yes." Standish nodded slowly. "Then here's what I recommend. We file 2 things simultaneously. The injunction to stop any foreclosure action that can go in front of Judge Merritt this week, and I believe he'll grant it based on what you have, and a formal fraud complaint with the territorial prosecutor's office. Not the county office, the territorial office in Oklahoma City. This is larger than a county matter." "How long does that take?" "The injunction, 2 weeks at most. The fraud investigation," she tilted her head, "months, potentially. But the injunction protects the property in the meantime. And once the fraud complaint is filed, Harlan loses the ability to quietly make this go away. It becomes a matter of public record." Rhett spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "What about the sister in Tennessee?" Standish looked at him. I've had no response from the estate inquiry I sent to Tennessee. If she doesn't respond within 60 days, the estate goes to probate and will be managed by the court during that period. She paused. If there's a fraud case being actively investigated, it's very unlikely a probate court would allow the property to be sold for debt settlement. They'd freeze it pending resolution. And if the fraud is proven, Eleanor asked, the manufactured portion of the debt is invalidated. Any money Harlan took from the cattle sales becomes a recoverable asset. The property's actual financial picture, which, based on your analysis, was stable and possibly profitable, becomes the legal basis for the estate's value. Standish looked at her. The ranch is not going to Harlan. Not if this case goes forward. Eleanor breathed out slowly through her nose. She looked at the papers spread across Standish's desk. 2 weeks of work that had started with a hairpin and a locked tin, and the particular shade of ink in a forged ledger entry. It didn't feel like a victory yet. It felt like the moment before a hard stretch of road, when you can see where you're going, but not what the ground is actually like. File everything, she said. Tin. The news that someone had filed a fraud complaint against Victor Harlan reached Red Hollow in the particular way that significant news reached small places. Not all at once, but in pieces, from multiple directions, each piece arriving slightly garbled and then getting corrected in conversation until the actual shape of it emerged. Eleanor knew it was coming before it arrived because Standish had sent word that the filings were submitted, and she knew that court filings were public record and that someone in the county clerk's office would notice the name on the complaint within 48 hours. What she hadn't anticipated was Harlan's response. She was in the study on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard the wagon in the yard. She looked out the window and saw 2 men she didn't recognize dismounting, and then a third man who stayed in the wagon, and she recognized the third man by the set of his shoulders before she could see his face properly. Carver. She went downstairs at a deliberate pace, not rushing, because rushing communicated something she didn't want to communicate, and opened the front door before anyone knocked. Carver was at the porch steps, the 2 men behind him at a respectful distance that was also clearly a strategic distance. Miss Whitmore, he said, with the same pleasant smile from the hotel dining room. I hope we're not interrupting. What can I do for you, Mr. Carver? Mr. Harlan wanted me to deliver a message personally. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He's filed a response to the injunction with the county court. He wanted you to have a copy before it was served formally. She took the envelope. That's considerate of him. He also wanted me to tell you. Carver paused, and the pleasant smile shifted slightly, becoming something with less warmth and more edge. That this course of action you're pursuing is going to cause a lot of people a lot of unnecessary difficulty. That these things have a way of becoming very complicated for everyone involved, not just for Mr. Harlan. That sounds like a threat, Eleanor said. It's an observation. Make your observations from the road next time, Mr. Carver. You're on private property. Something moved in Carver's face. Not the smile. The smile stayed. Just something behind it, a recalibration. Mr. Harlan is a patient man, he said. I'm sure he is, she said. So am I. Good afternoon. She held the door open in the way that made it very clear the door was about to close, and after a moment Carver turned and walked back to the wagon, and the 2 men followed, and the wagon left. Eleanor went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and realized her hands were entirely steady and had been the entire time, which she found slightly surprising. She opened the envelope. Harlan's response to the injunction was 40 pages long, which was itself a statement. He'd had lawyers working through the night, which meant he'd known about the filing almost immediately. She read through it at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold before she was halfway through. The core of his response was a counter-narrative, that Gerald Whitfield himself had authorized the modifications to the account records as part of a restructuring plan agreed to with Harlan as the creditor, that the easement was a valid verbal agreement witnessed by a third party, that Eleanor had no legal standing to bring any action on behalf of the estate, and that the survey work on the property had been conducted with Whitfield's personal permission. It was well written. That was the frustrating thing. It was the work of lawyers who were very good at making things that weren't true sound exactly as plausible as things that were. Rhett came in from the yard as she was finishing it. He read her face before he looked at the papers. Bad? Expensive, she said, and professional. He has 3 territorial attorneys on this. She set the last page down. He says Whitfield authorized the account changes. He says the easement was valid. He says the survey was permitted. None of that is true. No. But proving it isn't true requires a hearing, and at a hearing his lawyers will be in that room making these arguments, and we need Standish to counter them, and that takes time, and she stopped herself. It takes time, she said again, more quietly, which is what he wants. Run up the costs, run up the delays, see if we run out of money or energy or both before it reaches a judge. Rhett sat down across from her. He looked at the 40 pages of legal response spread across the table. We're not going to run out, he said. I know. I mean it. The Park brothers said they'll defer their wages until this is resolved. Sorensen said the same. This place hasn't gone under in 18 years and it's not going under now. She looked at him. He wasn't making a speech. He wasn't built for speeches. He was just saying what was true. In the flat declarative way he said true things. We need Alderman's testimony, she said. In person, if possible. If he can come to Guthrie and speak to the investigator in person, it cuts through a lot of the narrative Harlan is building. You think he'll come? I think he's as worried about his brokerage's reputation as we are about this ranch. If money moved through his operation in a fraudulent way, his name is on that transaction. She started stacking the pages back together. I'm going to telegraph him tomorrow. And in the meantime, she looked at the papers in her hands. Then she looked at Rhett. In the meantime, she said, we make sure everything on this ranch that can be documented is documented. The books, the correspondence, the cattle counts, the equipment, everything. If Harlan wants to argue that Whitfield authorized those account changes, we need to show, from every other record on this property, that the ranch was being managed by a man who paid attention to what he owned and wouldn't have signed off on an accounting change that made no sense. Character evidence. Character evidence, she agreed. Gerald Whitfield was a specific kind of man. We're going to need to show exactly what kind. Dora turned out to have a memory for detail that rivaled Eleanor's own, and in some respects exceeded it, because Dora's memory was for people rather than numbers, which was a different kind of precision. She sat with Eleanor that evening and talked for 2 hours about Gerald Whitfield. Not sentimental. Dora wasn't built for sentiment, but specific. The way he reviewed his accounts every Sunday morning, first thing, before anything else. The way he kept duplicates of every major receipt in a separate tin from the main records, because he'd been in a fire once in his 20s that had burned a ledger and he'd never forgiven himself the loss of the record. The way he'd argued with a supplier in town about a $2 overcharge on a feed order for 40 minutes, because the principle mattered to him more than the $2. The duplicate receipts, Eleanor said, sitting up straight. Where? Dora blinked. I assumed you'd found them. They'd be in the study. I went through the study. I found the main ledgers and the correspondence files and the locked tin. He had a second tin, Dora said. Not locked. He didn't lock it because he thought if anyone was going to steal from him, they'd go for the locked one first. She paused. He told me that once. I thought it was funny at the time. Eleanor was already on her feet. The second tin was behind a stack of older ledgers on the bottom shelf, green rather than gray and entirely without marking on the outside. She opened it at the desk. Inside 3 years of duplicate receipts. Every major transaction, handwritten copies in Gerald Whitfield's careful script, dated and signed. Including, she found it, hands moving through the papers faster than was strictly careful, the cattle transport contract with Harlan Cattle Company from the previous year signed by Whitfield, with the payment terms clearly specified. Proceeds of sale to be deposited directly to account at First Territorial Bank, Red Hollow Branch, within 5 business days of completion of sale. Direct deposit. Not handed over to the transport contractor. Not collected by Harlan's men. Direct deposit. She sat back in the chair and held the receipt and understood that this was the piece Harlan hadn't known existed. Because if he'd known, he would have taken this tin when his man was in this room adjusting ledger entries. He'd taken the locked tin's contents and replaced them with the promissory note. He'd altered the visible records. But this tin, unlocked, unmarked, behind a stack of old ledgers, looking like nothing, he'd missed it. She held the receipt carefully, the way you hold something that survived an accident that should have destroyed it. The contract specified direct deposit. The alderman letter confirmed the payment was issued. The bank records showed no deposit. Harlan's man had collected a payment that the contract explicitly assigned to the Whitfield bank account. That wasn't a bookkeeping error or a disputed verbal arrangement or a matter of competing interpretations. That was theft. She showed Rhett the receipt that night on the porch because she'd gone outside to stand in the cold for a minute and think, and he'd come out after her without quite explaining why he was there, which she'd come to understand was just how he operated. He noticed when something was happening without needing it explained, and he showed up accordingly. He read it in the light from the doorway. "Direct deposit," he said. "Yes." He didn't authorize Harlan's men to collect anything. The contract says so explicitly. "Yes." He handed it back. The cold was serious that night, genuine late autumn cold that meant business, and their breath made small clouds in the dark. "What does Standish do with this?" he asked. "This is the chain of custody link she said we were missing. The contract specifies where the money goes, the broker confirms the payment was issued, the bank confirms it never arrived. There's only one place it could have gone." She folded the receipt carefully. "This turns a fraud complaint into a theft charge. Those are different things, legally and in terms of what a jury hears." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to let this go quietly." "No. If he knows we found this, he'll move faster, try to get the foreclosure through before the fraud investigation gains momentum, or try to discredit the receipt somehow, claim it's a forgery, claim it was superseded by a verbal modification." She looked at the dark yard. "We need to file this with Standish before the end of the week. That means another trip to Guthrie. 3 trips total," she said. "I've made worse commutes." He made a sound that might have been a quiet laugh, which was new. She didn't look at him because she thought that looking at him might make it stop. "Miss Whitmore." "Eleanor," she said, "we've found 4 hidden tins together. We've driven to Guthrie twice. You can call me Eleanor." A pause. "Eleanor." He said it carefully, like he was checking the weight of it. "When this is over, if it goes the way we're hoping, when it goes the way we're hoping." "When?" he said. "What are you planning?" She looked at the stars, which were numerous and impersonal, and didn't have any opinions about frontier legal cases. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I came here with a plan that stopped existing at the train station. I've been building a new one as I go." She paused. "I'd like to see it through, see what the ranch looks like when it's not fighting for its existence. I'd like to know what it is without all of this." He leaned against the porch post. "It's a good piece of land," he said, with the simple authority of someone who knew what good land felt like. "Even the north pasture, people around here have been dismissive of it because it's flat and dry, but it holds well in winter. The soil is deeper than it looks." "You love this place," she said. He considered that with the seriousness he gave to things worth being serious about. "I know it," he said. "Knowing is different from loving." "Is it?" Another quiet moment. "Maybe not as different as I thought," he said. She went back inside because the cold was becoming too much for standing still in. But she stood in the hallway for a moment before going up to the study, with the receipt in her hand and the particular awareness of someone who has just had a conversation that meant more than its words, and recognized it, and was not sure yet what to do with that recognition. She went upstairs. She put the receipt in the document case with the other evidence in the specific order Standish had asked for. She sat down at the desk. She thought about Rhett saying maybe not as different as I thought. Thought in the dark, against the porch post. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Transport contract found, direct deposit clause. Original receipt, establishes theft, not fraud alone." She underlined the last 4 words. Then she kept working, because that was what the situation required. And Eleanor Whitmore had learned a long time ago that there was almost no situation in the world that didn't eventually yield to someone who kept working at it long enough. Outside, the wind moved through the pasture, across the flat winter grass, past the fence lines that Rhett had built, and the gate he'd hung, and the well he'd dug, and went on past the survey stakes that had been pulled from the ground and were now sitting on the desk beside her notebook as physical evidence, and kept going into the enormous dark that the territory wore like a coat this time of year. The lamp on the desk burned steady. She turned the page and kept writing. The transport contract receipt changed Standish's posture in a way that Eleanor noticed the moment she laid it on the desk. The attorney had been precise and professional across 3 meetings now, measured in the way of someone who had learned that measured was safer than hopeful in legal work. But when she read the direct deposit clause, then read the alderman letter again, then looked at the bank statement showing no corresponding deposit, Something in her face settled into a different kind of certainty. "This is it," Standish said. "This is what we needed." "I thought the fraud complaint was already—" "The fraud complaint establishes intent to deceive through the accounts. This establishes the actual taking. There's a legal distinction that matters enormously at the level of the territorial court." She set the receipt down with the care of someone handling something that could break if rushed. Fraud requires proving a scheme. Theft requires proving a thing was taken. A jury understands theft. A jury can hold theft in their hands. Rhett, who was in the room this time without any discussion about whether he should be, looked at the document on the desk. "How long before the hearing?" "Judge Merritt has the injunction on his docket for next Thursday," Standish said. "I'm going to request that the fraud and theft evidence be presented at the same hearing, not as a separate filing, as supporting documentation for why the injunction must be made permanent rather than temporary." She looked at both of them. "If Merritt sees this receipt and the chain of evidence you've assembled, he has grounds to refer the entire matter to the territorial prosecutor the same day. That's what we want. Once it's in the hands of the territorial prosecutor's office, Harlan can't manage it at the county level anymore." "An alderman?" Eleanor asked. "I telegraphed him 3 days ago. He said he was willing to come to Guthrie, but he needed 2 weeks. 2 weeks puts him after the injunction hearing," Standish said, "but it puts him squarely in time for whatever follows. If the judge refers to the prosecutor will want to interview him anyway." She paused. "I need to tell you both something, and I want you to take it seriously." Eleanor waited. "When this hearing happens, Harlan will be in that room. His attorneys will be in that room. They are going to challenge every piece of evidence you've brought me, and they are going to challenge you specifically." She looked at Eleanor. "On your legal standing to bring any of this. They will argue that you have no relationship to this estate that a court is obligated to recognize." "They argued that in the response filing," Eleanor said. "Yes. And they'll argue it harder in person, because in person they can watch the judge's face when they say it." Standish folded her hands on the desk. "Judge Merritt is a fair man, but fair men have to work within the structure of the law, and the structure of the law is not always accommodating to women who are doing the right thing for reasons the law hasn't quite caught up to yet." Rhett shifted in his chair. "So what do we do about that?" Standish looked at him. "The most effective answer is if the property has someone with unambiguous legal standing supporting the complaint. Someone whose right to bring this evidence before the court isn't contestable." She paused. "Has there been any response from the sister in Tennessee?" "No," Eleanor said. "Then the next clearest candidate is someone with a financial or contractual stake in the property's survival." She kept her eyes on Rhett. "You have 8 years of service to this ranch. You have wages owed, presumably, since the estate hasn't been settled." 3 months, he said. 3 months of unpaid wages makes you a creditor of the estate. A creditor has standing to file for protection of estate assets against fraudulent claims. Standish looked between them. "I should have identified this earlier. It's not a complicated argument, but it gives us a second name on this filing, and that second name is someone whose stake in the property is clear and documented." Rhett looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. "It's your decision," she said. "It puts your name on this in a way that Harlan will notice." "My name's already on it," he said. "I've been driving to Guthrie with you for 3 weeks. He turned back to Standish. "Tell me what to sign." The week before the hearing had a particular kind of tension that Eleanor didn't know how to discharge, so she worked. She organized the evidence files in the order Standish had specified, cross-referenced 3 times. She wrote a detailed timeline of every documented event, every ledger entry, every transport record, every stake pulled from the ground, with dates and supporting documents noted in the margin. She sent another letter to Alderman confirming the hearing date and asking him to send a written deposition even if he couldn't appear in person, which he telegraphed back to say he would. She also, because there was nothing else to do about it, waited to see what Harlan would try next. He tried 2 things. The first arrived on Monday in the form of a letter from a land lawyer in Red Hollow named Sutter, representing an unnamed client, informing Eleanor that the unnamed client was prepared to offer a full settlement of all outstanding estate debts in exchange for a quitclaim deed on the Whitfield property to be executed within 5 business days. The letter did not name Harlan. It didn't need to. She gave it to Standish by telegraph, Settlement offer received. Property transfer demand. Refusing. Standish telegraphed back. Correct. File it. It shows desperation. The second thing was more physical. On Wednesday evening, 2 days before the hearing, someone cut the wire on the chicken coop and left the gate on the north pasture open. They lost 4 chickens to what was probably a coyote, and 8 cattle spent the night ranging across the neighboring property before the Park brothers found them at dawn and drove them back. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was taken. It was the kind of thing you couldn't prove was deliberate, the kind that could be weather or negligence or coincidence, and everyone on the ranch knew it was none of those things. Rhett spent Wednesday night walking the perimeter with Sorensen and a lantern, checking the fence lines. Eleanor saw them from the upstairs window at 2 in the morning, the small orange point of the lantern moving slowly along the boundary in the dark. She didn't sleep well. At breakfast, she was on her 3rd cup of coffee when Rhett came in from outside with the specific look of someone who hasn't slept and is managing it through will rather than energy. "All clear," he said. "I know, I was watching." He looked at her. Neither of them said what both of them were thinking, which was that Harlan was testing them, seeing if they could be rattled into a mistake or scared into a settlement before the hearing. 2 more days, Eleanor said. 2 more days, he agreed, and poured himself coffee. The territorial court in Guthrie was larger than Eleanor had pictured from Standish's descriptions. A proper courthouse with high ceilings and woodwork that took itself seriously, and a smell of old paper and newer varnish that she associated, correctly or not, with the idea of things being decided. They arrived the morning of the hearing with the document case, and Standish met them on the courthouse steps with the contained urgency of someone who has been preparing for this since 6 in the morning. "Harlan is already inside," she said. 3 attorneys. I recognize 2 of them from filings in other cases. They're capable. Don't let that worry you." She said this last part looking at Eleanor, who had not in fact been visibly worried. "Judge Meredith is punctual. We go in at 9. "Alderman's deposition?" Eleanor asked. "Filed last night. Meredith has it." Standish looked at the document case. "You have everything?" "In order. Twice." They went in. The courtroom was half full, which surprised Eleanor. She hadn't expected an audience for a civil injunction hearing, but Red Hollow was a small county and word had apparently moved fast, because there were perhaps 30 people in the gallery. Some she recognized from town, and some she didn't. Victor Harlan was seated at the respondent's table with his 3 attorneys arranged around him. This was the first time Eleanor had seen him, and she took a moment to look. He was exactly what Rhett had described, a man of 60 or so, with a broad, weathered face and neat gray hair, and a quality of settled, comfortable certainty about him, like someone who had been right about things so many times that being right had become a resting state. He wore a good coat, dark, well-fitted. His hands on the table were still. He looked at Eleanor when she sat down, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away first. They both simply stopped looking at the same time, which was different. Judge Meredith came in at 9 precisely. He was perhaps 55, with the lean economy of movement of someone who had sat in courtrooms for 30 years and stopped tolerating inefficiency around year 5. He looked at both tables with the even attention of someone who hadn't made up his mind and didn't intend to until he heard what there was to hear. "We're here on the matter of an injunction petition filed by the estate of Gerald Whitfield, represented by counsel for co-petitioners Rhett Callahan and Eleanor Whitmore, against the foreclosure claims of the Harlan Cattle Company." He said it with the flat precision of someone reading a thing for the record. "Mrs. Standish, your petition?" Standish stood. She was, Eleanor thought, very good at this. Not theatrical. Not in a courtroom where theatrical would work against you in front of a judge like Meredith, but clear and sequential, building the case the way you'd build a fence line, one post at a time with no gaps. She walked through the evidence in the order they'd arranged it. The ledger alterations with the photographic copies Eleanor had made of the relevant pages. The alderman letter and deposition confirming the cattle sale proceeds and their non-arrival in the Whitfield account. The transport contract with the direct deposit clause. The first territorial bank records. The Pruitt statements. Both of them, aunt and nephew. When she got to the railroad survey, the gallery was quiet in the way galleries get quiet when they understand what they're hearing. The Harlan Cattle Company's easement claim on the Whitfield property was filed 6 weeks after a right-of-way application was submitted to the Territorial Land Commission by a subsidiary of the Continental Pacific Railroad, Standish said. The route of that right-of-way crosses the exact parcels that Mr. Harlan has been attempting to acquire from the Whitfield estate. The manufactured debt, the easement claim, and the transport contract theft are not isolated actions. They are sequential steps in a single scheme to obtain property whose true value Mr. Harlan knew and concealed. One of Harlan's attorneys, a man named Voss, who had the practiced confidence of someone who spent a great deal of time in courtrooms, stood up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing evidence that has not been admitted." "It's a petition hearing, Mr. Voss, not a trial," Meredith said. "Sit down. You'll have your response." Voss sat, with the measured deliberateness of someone choosing their moments. Standish finished. She sat. Voss stood again, and Eleanor had to admit that he was also good. Good in the slick, efficient way of someone who knew how to create doubt without needing to establish truth. He challenged Eleanor's standing at length, argued that the ledger alterations could reflect authorized changes the petitioners simply hadn't been informed of, called the Pruitt Statements the motivated testimony of a woman whose nephew was facing potential legal exposure, and characterized the railroad connection as speculation built on circumstantial timing. He was particularly effective on the standing argument. Eleanor watched Judge Meredith's face while Voss made it, and the judge's expression gave away almost nothing, which was itself information. Then Meredith looked at Standish. "Counsel, address standing." Standish stood. "Mr. Callahan has documented unpaid wages constituting a creditor claim against the estate. As a creditor, his interest in preventing the estate from being stripped by fraudulent foreclosure is both clear and legally recognized. With respect to Miss Whitmore," she paused a single beat. "The deceased contracted with Miss Whitmore to manage his household and ultimately serve as a partner in the operation of this ranch. The contract, while unconventional, represents a material commitment by the estate. The evidence she has produced in support of this petition was gathered through her direct access to the estate records, access she was given in that capacity. A court that dismisses standing for the person most responsible for uncovering this fraud would be rewarding the fraudster for the incompleteness of his scheme." The gallery stirred. Meredith looked at his papers. He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "The transport contract," he said, the direct deposit clause. "Was this document in the regular course of estate records?" "It was found in the estate records, Your Honor, in a separate file maintained by the deceased." "And the ledger alterations? These are original documents?" "Yes, Your Honor. The originals are in my possession and available for court inspection." Meredith looked at the Harlan table. "Mr. Voss, your client's response filing states that the account modifications were authorized by the deceased. Can you produce documentation of that authorization?" Voss stood. "Mr. Whitfield's authorization was verbal, Your Honor, as part of a debt restructuring arrangement." "A verbal authorization for an account modification that resulted in the apparent transfer of over $260 to an unrelated account," Meredith said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "And your evidence for this verbal authorization is what, exactly?" Voss hesitated for precisely long enough to be visible. "The arrangement was understood between the parties." "That's not evidence, Mr. Voss. That's an assertion." Meredith set his papers down. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess to review the physical documents submitted by the petitioner." He left. Eleanor sat at the table and did not look at Harlan and did not look at the gallery. She looked at her hands on the surface of the table and breathed carefully. Rhett, beside her, said nothing. He was very still in the way he got still when something mattered. Standish leaned over and said quietly, "Meredith reviewed the transport contract last night. I know he did because the clerk confirmed the filing was accessed. He came in this morning having already read it." Eleanor absorbed that. "So the recess is to make the referral documentation," Standish said. "In my opinion." Well, the recess was 26 minutes. Meredith came back and looked at both tables with the same even attention as before, and then he spoke for 4 minutes in the precise language of judicial decision, and the substance of what he said was this. The injunction was granted. No foreclosure action on the Whitfield property could proceed pending investigation. The easement claim was stayed pending a full evidentiary challenge, and the matter of the altered ledgers and the transport contract proceeds was being referred immediately to the Office of the Territorial Prosecutor for Criminal Investigation. He also said, and this was the part Eleanor had not expected, that given the scope of the evidence presented and the indication that county-level officials may have had relationships with the respondent that created conflicts of interest, the investigation would be overseen by the territorial court directly rather than routed through the county system. He said all of this without looking at Victor Harlan. But Eleanor looked at Harlan, and she watched the thing that happened to his face in the moment after Meredith finished speaking. It was not dramatic. It was quieter than that. A slight contraction, a settling, as if something that had been held up by invisible pressure had been allowed to come down. He looked, for a moment, old. Then one of his attorneys leaned over and spoke in his ear, and his face rearranged itself into something composed. And he nodded once, and whatever she'd seen was gone. Voss was already on his feet requesting an appeal timeline. Meredith granted it with the indifference of a man who knew what the appeal would find. The gallery was not silent anymore. Eleanor looked at Standish. "Is that it?" she asked. "The injunction is it," Standish said. "The investigation is just beginning." What followed was not clean or quick, because nothing worth doing in a court of law was either of those things. The territorial prosecutor's investigator, a woman named Hartwell, 30s, with the brisk manner of someone who had a great deal of work and limited patience for people who wasted her time, arrived in Red Hollow 11 days after the hearing and spent 3 days working through the evidence Eleanor had assembled. She asked precise questions and wrote precise notes and expressed no opinions about anything, which Eleanor had learned to interpret as a professional virtue rather than a personal one. Alderman came from Tulsa in the 3rd week, as he'd promised. He testified to the investigator for 2 hours about the cattle sale, the payment issued, the representative who had collected it, and the account it had never reached. He was careful and unhappy and thorough, which was everything Eleanor had hoped for. Carver, Harlan's man who had approached Eleanor in the hotel dining room and then appeared at the ranch, was identified through the transport records as the individual who had collected the cattle sale proceeds. When the investigator went to find him, he had, in the language of the territory's paperwork, relocated. But his signature was on the transport receipt, and signatures didn't relocate. Dale Pruitt gave a formal statement retracting his witness to the easement agreement. He was frightened when he gave it, visibly, and the investigator noted his demeanor in her own records, not as a point against him, but as context for why a 20-year-old working man might have signed something he shouldn't have. His aunt sat outside the interview room the entire time. He came out looking as though he'd put something down that had been heavier than he'd realized. Victor Harlan was interviewed formally by the investigator on a Tuesday in the 4th week. Eleanor didn't witness it. Nobody outside the investigator's office did. What came out afterward, filtered through Standish and then through the county's extraordinary capacity for information to move between people without apparent mechanism, was that Harlan had maintained his composed certainty through the entire interview and that his attorneys had spoken for him on approximately 60% of the questions. 2 weeks after that interview, the first of Harlan's former business associates came forward. It started with a man named Kellner, who had sold Harlan grazing land 5 years ago at a price that, now that he understood what Harlan had known about planned irrigation routes, had been considerably below what he should have received. Then a merchant in Red Hollow who had held a debt instrument that Harlan had convinced him to extend under false pretenses. Then a homesteader's widow from the eastern county whose late husband's property had been foreclosed on the basis of a debt that bore a remarkable structural resemblance to the one manufactured for Gerald Whitfield. The prosecutor's investigation, which had opened as a single fraud and theft case, expanded. Standish sent word to Eleanor each time something new developed, in letters that were precise and informative and occasionally, in a single phrase or a particular word choice, revealed that the attorney was something close to pleased. Eleanor read each letter at the desk in Gerald Whitfield's study and wrote back with questions and updates, and once, with the information that the Continental Pacific's regional representative had sent a formal inquiry to the estate about the right-of-way negotiation, which they wanted to proceed with as soon as the property's legal status was clear. She wrote that letter to Standish sitting very straight in Gerald Whitfield's chair, with the lamp lit in the winter dark against the window, and she allowed herself, for approximately 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of what that letter meant. $4,000 to $6,000 for the right-of-way, against $940 of manufactured debt, that was going to be invalidated, against the recovered 260 from the cattle sale, which the prosecutor's office had traced to an account in Harlan's name and which was already in the process of being returned to the estate. The ranch wasn't just surviving, it was going to be solvent in a way it perhaps hadn't been in years. She let herself feel it for 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. The formal charges against Victor Harlan were filed 6 weeks after the hearing, and they were more extensive than Eleanor had expected, even given everything she knew: theft by fraud, conversion of funds, filing false instruments with the land office, conspiracy to defraud an estate, a separate count related to the earlier homesteader case that the expanded investigation had uncovered. The county judge, the one who did business with Harlan, recused himself from anything related to the case within 48 hours of the charges being filed, citing a conflict of interest he appeared to have discovered very suddenly and very completely. 2 members of the town council in Red Hollow, who had been identified in the investigation as recipients of payments from Harlan in exchange for favorable treatment on land matters, resigned within a week of each other. Red Hollow was a small town, and small towns process significant information the way rivers process a heavy rain, noisily, with a great deal of overflow, and then gradually, with the sediment settling to the bottom and the surface going still again. Eleanor watched it happen over the course of those weeks from the vantage point of the Whitfield Ranch, which was far enough outside of town to observe without being entirely inside the noise. People in town had begun to treat her differently. Not dramatically. Nobody made speeches or changed their manner in ways that announced themselves. But where before there had been a certain peripheral quality to how she was regarded, a sense of people watching without quite acknowledging, now there was something more direct. The feed store owner, who had previously managed to be busy whenever she came in, found time to have a conversation with her about hay prices. The woman who ran the dry goods counter, who had been polite but careful, asked after the ranch with what appeared to be genuine interest. Rhett told her one evening that 2 of the ranchers from the neighboring properties had stopped him on the road to say they were glad about the hearing's outcome. "Did they say anything about the ranch?" she asked. "Said they hoped it stayed working land," he said. "Said they'd seen enough property go out of family hands in this county." She thought about that phrasing. Family hands. Neither of them said anything about it. The hardest conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the estate's formal probate hearing. Eleanor was in the study when she heard the wagon in the yard, and she looked out and saw a woman she didn't know climbing down from a hired rig, middle-aged, thin, dressed for travel, with the look of someone who had been in a train car for a very long time and was still carrying the discomfort of it. She went downstairs. The woman at the door was Gerald Whitfield's sister, Margaret, from Tennessee. She looked at Eleanor with the specific expression of a person arriving at a place they have complicated feelings about, which in this case was apparently a ranch that had almost been stolen, and the strange woman who had, for reasons that must have seemed very unclear from a distance, prevented it. "Miss Whitmore?" she said. "Mrs. Beaumont," Eleanor said, because Standish had told her the sister's married name. "Please come in." They sat in the parlor, and Dora brought coffee without being asked, and Margaret Beaumont looked at the photograph of her brother on the mantelpiece for a moment before she looked at Eleanor. "I got the letters," she said, "from the attorney. Both of them. The one about Gerald's death, and the one about the legal situation. I should have responded sooner." She stopped. "I didn't know what to say." "You don't need to explain yourself to me," Eleanor said. "No, but—" Margaret looked at her hands. "He never said much about you in his letters to me. He mentioned he was corresponding with someone. He wasn't a man who said much about personal things." She paused. "He was a difficult man to stay in contact with. We went years sometimes without writing." "I know," Eleanor said. "He mentioned it." Margaret looked at her. "He mentioned his difficulties? In the way he had, obliquely. He said he was better with land than with people, and that most of the people who'd known him a long time would probably agree." Something moved in Margaret Beaumont's face. "That sounds like him." She was quiet for a moment. "The attorney tells me the estate is considerably more valuable than we thought. Because of the railroad?" "Yes." "And the fraud case is proceeding?" "Yes." "And you—" She stopped, started again. "What are you planning, after all of this?" Eleanor looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. Gerald Whitfield squinting into the sun, not looking at the camera, with the tiredness of a man who had worked hard land for a long time. "That's partly up to you," she said honestly. "You're the heir. Whatever the estate produces, the right-of-way payment, the recovered funds, that's yours to decide about. And the ranch itself? That's yours too." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She turned her coffee cup in her hands the way people turn things when they were thinking. "I haven't been to Oklahoma Territory in 12 years, she said. "I have a life in Tennessee. My husband's business is there. My children." She looked around the room. "I can't run this place." Eleanor waited. "The attorney suggested," Margaret said slowly, "that the estate could be managed by someone with demonstrated investment in its operation. Someone who has documented wages owed, and someone who has been, by any account, the reason it still exists." She looked at Eleanor directly. "She suggested I might want to consider a sale if the right parties were interested, at a fair price." Eleanor understood what was being said, and it took a moment to process the full weight of it. "I'd need to discuss that with Rhett," she said. "Of course. He has more stake in this property than I do, in some ways. He's been here 8 years. I know." The attorney was very clear about that. Margaret set her cup down. "I want you to know, I'm not here to undo what you did. I understand what happened here. I understand that if you hadn't stayed—" She stopped. "Gerald would have wanted it protected. Whatever he was, he cared about this land. He talked about it in his letters the way some men talk about their children." She paused. "I'd rather it go to people who will actually work it than go through some court process that ends with a stranger buying it for less than it's worth." Eleanor looked at her. "Let me talk to Rhett tonight," she said, "and I'll send word to Standish." Margaret nodded. She looked at the photograph again. "He looks tired in that picture," she said. "He does," Eleanor agreed. "He always was." She said it without bitterness, just the flat recognition of someone who had known a person a long time. "But he built something real here. That's more than some people manage." Eleanor thought about the ledgers and the hidden tin and the European sevens in the forged entries and the survey stakes pulled from the cold ground and everything she'd assembled in this study over the weeks that had become months without her quite noticing. "Yes," she said, "it is." She found Rhett at the barn, at the end of the day, doing the last check on the horses before dark. She told him what Margaret had said simply and directly, because that was how she talked to him now. No preamble, no softening, just the actual information. He listened without speaking. He had a curry comb in his hand and he turned it over and back while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She wants to sell," he said. "At a fair price, she's not trying to take advantage. And you're asking because it affects you as much as it affects me. More, maybe." She leaned against the stall post. "You've been here 8 years. You have wages owed, which means you have a creditor's claim, which means you have legal standing to make an offer on the estate assets. The right-of-way payment covers the debt entirely and leaves a surplus. With the recovered funds from Harlan's theft," she paused. "You could buy this ranch, Rhett. It's not impossible." He was very still. The horse in the stall behind him moved slightly, and he put a hand against its neck without thinking, the automatic steadying gesture of someone who has done it thousands of times. "And you?" he said. He was looking at the comb in his hand. "What do you do?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I haven't gotten that far." He finally looked up. The barn light was low and golden in the way of late afternoon, and he looked at her with the direct, considering quality he had, the one that didn't try to say more than it meant and didn't try to say less. "The ranch needs good accounts," he said, "kept properly, by someone who knows what altered ink looks like." She looked at him. "And someone who can write letters to territorial commissioners," he continued, still with that careful directness, "and read documents that are 40 pages long and find the one false thing in them." "Are you offering me a job?" she said. "After everything?" "No," he said. He set the curry comb down on the stall rail. "I'm pointing out that I know what the ranch needs." He paused. "I'm also pointing out that I know what I..." He stopped. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who finished sentences like that one easily. He worked his way up to things. "I'm pointing out what I'd want," he said finally, "if I had a choice about it." The horse shifted again, and the barn was very quiet around that sentence. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Make an offer on the estate," she said. "Tomorrow, before anything else moves." "That's not an answer," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's the first step." She straightened away from the post. "Everything else we can figure out from there." She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him pick up the curry comb again, the small sound of it against the stall rail, and then the soft movement of him returning to the horse. And she thought, this is what it actually looks like. Not what she'd imagined from 6 letters and a train ride. Something harder and more specific, and considerably more real. The last light was going off the pasture when she got back to the porch, and the north boundary was dark against the pale sky, and somewhere out in that flat grass were the holes where 8 survey stakes had been pulled from the ground and carried inside as evidence. And there was nothing out there now but the land itself. She went inside and lit the lamp and sat down at the desk and wrote 2 letters, one to Standish and one to Margaret Beaumont. And when she was done, she sat for a moment with her pen still in her hand and let herself understand that whatever was going to happen next was something she hadn't planned for, which was different from every plan she'd had before, and, she thought, probably better because of it. Standish's reply to Eleanor's letter came back in 4 days, which was fast enough to mean the attorney had written it the same evening she received it. The letter was 3 pages, which was longer than Standish usually wrote, and the extra length was not wasted. She had already begun the process of formalizing a purchase offer from the estate's creditor, Rhett, and had contacted Margaret Beaumont's own attorney in Tennessee to begin negotiations on a sale price. She had also, and this was the part Eleanor read twice, spoken again with the Continental Pacific representative, who had confirmed that the right-of-way payment would be released as soon as the property title was clear and undisputed. The number the representative had confirmed was $5,200. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk and sat with that number for a moment. Not because it was a surprise exactly. Standish had given her the range weeks ago, but because a number you've been told in the abstract becomes a different thing when it's written down on paper in someone's actual handwriting. $5,200 was more than Gerald Whitfield had paid for the entire ranch 18 years ago. Adjusted for what Rhett had told her about land prices in the territory at that time, it was more than the manufactured debt by a factor of 5. It was enough to buy the ranch from Margaret at a fair price and still have operating capital left over for the first year. She wrote back to Standish that same afternoon, "Proceed with the purchase offer. The price Margaret Beaumont asks, within reason, is the price we'll pay." She used the word "we" without thinking about it, and then read it back and left it. The probate hearing was held in Guthrie on a Tuesday in late January, and it was considerably less dramatic than the injunction hearing, which Eleanor suspected was how probate hearings were supposed to go. Judge Meredith reviewed the estate's position, the cleared debt, the recovered funds, the right-of-way payment in process, the agreed sale to Rhett Callahan, and approved the transaction with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen more complicated matters that morning. Margaret Beaumont attended by letter rather than in person, which the court accepted without objection. Her written statement confirmed that she considered the sale price fair, that she was satisfied with the outcome of the fraud investigation as it applied to her brother's estate, and that she wished the new owner well with the property. Rhett signed the purchase documents at the clerk's table in the courthouse hallway afterward, with Standish beside him and Eleanor beside Standish. The clerk was an older man who did this 20 times a week and showed it, stamping and initialing without ceremony, and Rhett signed his name at the bottom of the deed transfer with the careful deliberateness of a man who didn't write often and wasn't going to rush it when it mattered. He looked at the deed for a moment after he signed it. Just looked at it. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," Standish said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was true, and he was acknowledging it rather than celebrating it, and folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. Outside on the courthouse steps, Eleanor pulled her coat against the January cold and looked at the street and thought about the train platform in Red Hollow, where she'd stood with a bag and $31 and no plan beyond the one that had just stopped existing. "You all right?" Rhett said beside her. "Yes," she said. "I'm just thinking about the beginning. Of what? Of all of this. She gestured vaguely, which encompassed the courthouse and the street and the territory and the months between then and now. The bread, she said. You brought me bread. He looked at her sideways. Mrs. Pruitt brought it. You carried it. I didn't know what else to bring to that situation, he said, which was so straightforwardly human that she almost laughed. It was the right thing, she said, for what it's worth. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Eleanor. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the street, at a wagon going by, at nothing in particular, in the way of a man who finds it easier to say difficult things when he isn't also managing eye contact. I've been trying to work out how to ask you something, he said. I know. He looked at her now. You know. I've been waiting for you to get there, she said. You work up to things. I've noticed. Something in his face did the thing it did sometimes. Not quite a smile, more the potential for one. The place where a smile would be if he let it. You could make it easier, he said. I could, she agreed, but you'd have gotten there eventually, and it seemed important that you get there yourself. He looked at her for a long moment with that direct, considering quality she'd learned to read as the most honest thing about him. More honest than anything he said, because it was what happened before he decided what to say. Stay, he said, not because of the accounts, or the letters, or any of it. Stay because... He stopped. He tried again. I know what the ranch is without you now. I knew what it was before you got there. I don't particularly want to go back to knowing it that way. It was not a pretty speech. It didn't have any of the language that speeches were supposed to have. It had gaps in it where the feeling was bigger than the words he had available, and he didn't try to fill those gaps with words that weren't true, which was exactly the thing about him that had made her trust him from the first week. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes? Yes, I'll stay. She turned toward the street. Did you think I was going to say no? I didn't know, he said. That's why it took me a while to ask. She started down the steps. Come on, she said. Standish is waiting, and we have a right-of-way negotiation to finalize before the railroad changes its mind. He came down the steps beside her, and she was aware of him there. Not the abstract awareness of someone nearby, but the specific particular awareness of this specific person with his dented hat and his scarred hands and his way of going quiet when things mattered. And she thought that this was not what she had planned when she got on the train in Ohio, and it was better than what she'd planned. And she wasn't going to say that out loud because some things you kept for yourself. Victor Harlan's trial began in March and lasted 11 days. Eleanor attended 2 of them. Not out of satisfaction, or at least not primarily. She attended because Standish needed her available in case Harlan's attorneys tried to challenge the provenance of the ledger evidence, which they did on the second day, and which Standish handled with the brisk efficiency of someone who had prepared for that specific argument for 3 months. Harlan was, throughout the proceedings, composed. He sat at the defendant's table with his good coat and his settled manner and his 3 attorneys, and he looked like a man who had decided that the dignified thing was to maintain the surface regardless of what the surface was concealing, which was perhaps the most honest thing Eleanor had ever seen him do. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, watching him. Not triumph, not anger. Something quieter than either of those. A kind of tiredness on behalf of all the years he'd spent building something that turned out to be entirely constructed of other people's losses. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. The verdict was guilty on 4 of the 5 counts. Acquitted on 1 count that involved a transaction the prosecutor couldn't establish a complete chain of evidence for, which Standish had predicted with unfortunate accuracy. Sentencing was 5 years, with restitution ordered to multiple parties, including the Whitfield estate. When the verdict was read, Harlan nodded once, very slightly, as if acknowledging something that had always been a possibility and was now simply a fact. Then his attorneys spoke to him quietly, and he was let out, and Eleanor watched him go and then looked down at her hands in her lap and thought about Gerald Whitfield, who had worked 18 years to build something real, and had not lived to see the man who'd tried to take it face what he'd done. There was no satisfying way to land on that. She didn't try to. Outside the courthouse, Standish shook her hand with genuine warmth, which was new. You built that case, the attorney said. Not me. I filed it and argued it, but you built it. We built it, Eleanor said. A lot of people built it. Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you. Standish's mouth curved slightly. I mean that as a compliment. Eleanor thought about Dale Pruitt and his aunt, and the signed statement that had taken courage he hadn't known he'd need. She thought about Sorensen and the Park brothers deferring wages without being asked. She thought about aldermen coming from Tulsa in the cold to give testimony that cost him professional discomfort, but which he'd given honestly because he was more interested in being straight about what had happened than in avoiding the inconvenience of the truth. A lot of people, she said again. Spring came to Red Hollow in fits and starts, the way spring came to the territory, a warm week in March that made everything believe, then a cold snap that killed several things that had believed too early, then a gradual, grudging warming that eventually became permanent sometime in April. The Continental Pacific right-of-way work began in May. Eleanor watched the survey crew come through the North Pasture, not Langdon this time, a different crew with legitimate authorization and clean paperwork, and marked the actual route with the same red cloth stakes she'd pulled from the ground 6 months before. And she thought about the difference between a thing done in secret and a thing done in daylight, and how the thing itself was the same, but everything around it was different. The crew foreman was a practical man who wanted to know about soil depth and drainage, and whether the fence lines on the north boundary were the permanent lines or working lines. She told him with specificity because she had walked every inch of that perimeter and knew it better than she'd known any piece of land in her life. Rhett watched the conversation from near the barn with the patient attention of a man who had learned that Eleanor talking to people in a professional capacity did not require his involvement and went better without it, which was a thing she appreciated about him more than she'd said. The right-of-way payment was received in June, $5,200 as confirmed, transferred through First Territorial Bank. Eleanor sat with the bank statement for a long time after it arrived. They paid Margaret Beaumont's sale price first, which cleared the title completely. Then they set aside operating capital for the year. Hay, equipment repairs, wages properly paid for the first time in too long, a new section of fence on the west boundary that had needed replacing since before she arrived. Then a sum went to Standish, the contingency percentage they'd agreed on, and Eleanor sent it with a letter that was brief because what she wanted to say was more than a letter could hold. What remained was not a fortune, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it had been earned with more than money. Dora Flagg stayed through the summer and then through the fall, which Eleanor had suspected would happen because Dora had the look of a woman who had decided this was where she was and had stopped considering alternatives. She didn't say this directly. She simply continued to cook and clean and sit at the kitchen table in the evenings with her own coffee and her own observations, which were as sharp as they'd always been and occasionally more pointed. "You're happy," she said to Eleanor one evening in July, with the slightly suspicious tone of someone identifying a condition they want to verify. "I think so," Eleanor said. "Most of the time." "Most of the time is what happy actually looks like," Dora said. "People who say they're happy all the time are either lying or not paying attention." Eleanor looked at her. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've always been philosophical. You've been too busy to notice." She poured more coffee. "He is too, for what it's worth. Happy. He doesn't say so, but you can tell by how he moves. Men like that, when they're carrying something heavy, they move different. He used to move different." Eleanor didn't say anything, but she filed it away the way she filed all the things Dora said that were more than they appeared to be on the surface. The formal arrangement between Eleanor and Rhett happened in September, on a morning when the air had the first real bite of fall in it, and the North Pasture was doing something complicated with light that made it look entirely different from how it looked any other time of year. It was not a large wedding, because neither of them wanted a large wedding, and the people who mattered were not numerous. Standish came from Guthrie, which surprised Eleanor, and which she found she was more moved by than she'd anticipated. The Park brothers came in their good shirts, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested the shirts were the problem. Sorensen attended with the patience of a man who attended things because that was what you did for people you respected. Mrs. Pruitt came, and brought Dale, who had found work at a different ranch, and seemed to have put some of his earlier guilt down. Dora cried, which she did in a contained, private way that she would have denied if asked. They were married by the justice of the peace from Guthrie outdoors, on the flat ground between the house and the barn, because the house wasn't large enough and neither of them wanted to be inside for it. Afterward, there was food, Dora's production, which was extensive and very good, and conversation, and the particular quality of an afternoon that is aware it is significant without being told. The light went off the pasture in layers, the way it did out here, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dried grass and the coming cold. Eleanor stood with Rhett near the porch at the end of it, when most people had gone, and watched the last of the light go. "This is not what I planned," she said. "I know," he said. "I planned something much smaller." "I know that too." She looked out at the north pasture, at the flat line of it against the evening sky, at the fence lines running their straight, useful distances, at the place where the Continental Pacific right-of-way had been marked and cleared and was already showing the preliminary grade work for the rail bed that would come through next spring. "Gerald Whitfield spent 18 years here and never quite figured out how to let anyone in," she said. "And then someone came in anyway and tried to take everything he'd built, and it almost worked." She paused. "There's something in that I keep coming back to, about what it costs to do everything alone." Rhett was quiet for a moment. He wasn't entirely alone, he said. He had Dora. He had Sorensen and the boys. He stopped. He had people who would have done more if he'd let them. "I know." She looked at the sky. "I think that's what I keep coming back to, that the hard part wasn't the fraud or Harlan or the legal fight. The hard part was deciding to let people in when every instinct said to handle it yourself." She thought about the $31 and the cracked heel on the left boot and the train platform with nobody on it, and the moment she'd stood on that platform and decided, not dramatically, not with any certainty that it was right, that she wasn't getting back on the train. She thought about what she'd known and what she hadn't known, and the gap between those things, which was where all the actual life had turned out to be. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said. "When I stayed, I want to be honest about that. I thought I was staying because I had nowhere else to go and a problem I could see how to approach. But there are lots of problems in Ohio. There were other trains." Rhett looked at her. "So why did you stay?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about honest things. "Because something about this place felt like it was asking to be understood," she said. "The ledgers, the land, She paused. The man standing on the platform with bread he didn't know what to do with. She glanced at him. "I thought, there's something true here, and someone ought to stay and find out what it is." He was quiet for a long moment. "And did you find out what it is?" She looked at the ranch, at all of it, the barn and the fence lines and the pasture and the house behind them with the lamp already lit in the kitchen where Dora was cleaning up. And she thought about Gerald Whitfield's careful receipts in the unlocked tin, his duplicate records, his refusal to sell the west boundary at 60 cents on the dollar, even though he couldn't have articulated in precise legal terms why it was worth more. She thought about the particular stubbornness of people who build things and refuse to let them go. "Yes," she said. "I think I found out what it is. There are things about that first year that Eleanor would carry for the rest of her life without them getting lighter. Because some things don't get lighter. They just become familiar weight, which is different. She carried the knowledge that a man she'd agreed to marry, whom she'd never met, had been careful and honest and had not deserved what happened to him. She carried the knowledge that the law was slow and incomplete and required people to push it in order for it to move, and that most people didn't push it, and that this was why men like Harlan operated for so long before anyone stopped them. She carried the specific memory of those 8 survey stakes in the cold ground and what they represented, someone's certainty that the work was already done, that the thing was already won, that the only people who could stop him had already given up. She carried the knowledge that they hadn't. There's a particular kind of person who looks at an impossible situation and thinks, but what if you just don't accept that it's impossible? Not because they're reckless or naive, but because they've looked at the actual specific components of the impossibility and they can see concretely which ones are real and which ones are pressure designed to feel real. Eleanor Whitmore was that kind of person, and she had been before she ever got on the train in Ohio. And the territory hadn't created that in her so much as it had given her the conditions to find it out. The ranch grew, not quickly, because the territory didn't reward impatience and neither did cattle, but steadily, in the way of things built on actual ground. The right-of-way income in the first year provided the foundation. The second year, with proper capital behind the cattle operation, the margins improved. By the third year, the Callahan Ranch, as it had become known in the county, though Eleanor always thought of it in her head with both names, because both names were true, was running a genuine surplus and had hired 2 more hands and rebuilt the barn roof that had been a problem since before she arrived. Rhett was not an easy man to live with, in the way that honest people are often not easy to live with, because honest people don't smooth things over when they could just as well say what they mean, and what they mean is sometimes inconvenient. He had opinions about how certain things should be done that were completely resistant to discussion. He didn't talk in the mornings before the second cup of coffee and was not apologetic about it. He worried about the cattle in ways that he converted into work rather than conversation, which meant Eleanor learned to read his silences for content. She was not easy to live with either. She kept the accounts with an intensity that occasionally tipped into obsession. She wrote letters when she was anxious and made lists when she was worried, and occasionally woke at 4 in the morning and went to the study to work for 2 hours because her brain had decided the middle of the night was an appropriate time for problem solving. She had opinions about things she admitted she hadn't earned opinions on yet, and the opinions were usually right, which she was aware was not an endearing quality in combination. They were not a perfect match in the way that stories sometimes make people perfect matches. They were a workable match, which is rarer and more durable and built on the understanding that the other person is going to be themselves rather than the version of themselves that would be most convenient for you. Dale Pruitt came to work the ranch in the second year, which Mrs. Pruitt had suggested and Eleanor had thought about carefully before agreeing. He was a good worker, genuinely good, not trying to make up for something good, just a young man who knew cattle and knew land and had learned something from the experience of signing a paper without reading it that had become part of how he moved through the world. He was steady and showed up early and didn't waste anything. Eleanor liked him. In the particular way you like people who have learned things the hard way and let those things make them more careful rather than more bitter. Sorensen stayed until he was 70 and then retired to Guthrie where his daughter lived, and Eleanor and Rhett drove him there in the wagon, and Dora packed enough food for the trip that he would have had enough for a week, even if the wagon had broken down somewhere in between. Dora herself stayed for 6 years, which was 3 more years than Eleanor had expected and probably 2 more than Dora had planned. And when she finally left, it was for a nephew in Kansas City who had been asking her to come for years and had finally asked in a way she couldn't decline. She hugged Eleanor with the compact, efficient warmth of a woman who didn't hug often and meant it when she did. She told Rhett he'd better not let the kitchen go, in a tone that suggested she had low confidence in this, but was making the requirement known anyway. Rhett told her the kitchen would be fine. Dora looked at Eleanor and said, with the dry precision that had never changed, "Make sure he means it." "I always do," Eleanor said. What? Years later, enough years that Eleanor had lost count of the exact number and had stopped caring, a young woman came to the land office in Red Hollow asking about homestead opportunities in the county. She was perhaps 24, traveling alone, with the look of someone who had made a decision that was bigger than she'd fully processed yet, and was trying to appear more settled about it than she was. Eleanor was in the land office on other business and heard the conversation through the window between the main office and the clerk's area, and she recognized something in the quality of the young woman's voice. Not the content, but the underneath of it, the particular frequency of someone standing at the edge of something and holding herself very still. She went around to the front. The young woman looked at her with the careful watchfulness of someone who has learned that strangers sometimes want things from you. "I'm Eleanor Callahan," Eleanor said. "I run the Callahan Ranch 4 miles south. I've been in this county for," she calculated briefly, "quite a while. I'm looking for," the young woman started. "I know what you're looking for," Eleanor said. "It's complicated, and it costs more than you're expecting, and the land is harder than it looks, and everyone is going to tell you it's not a good idea." She paused. "All of that is true. It's also not the whole truth." The young woman looked at her. "What's the rest of it?" Eleanor thought about a train platform in November with nobody on it. She thought about $31 in a handkerchief and a cracked heel on a left boot, and the particular quality of standing in a place that hadn't expected you and deciding to be there anyway. "Come out to the ranch this weekend," she said. Bring your questions. We'll talk through it properly. The young woman, her name was Vera, Eleanor learned later, from Missouri, with a brother who'd told her she was making a mistake and a mother who had given her $60 and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone had done, came on Saturday with a notebook and a list of specific questions that Eleanor recognized, in structure and in kind, as the questions of someone who was genuinely going to do this and needed information rather than reassurance. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Rhett came in at noon, looked at the conversation in progress, poured himself coffee, and sat at the end of the table without interrupting, which was the kind of understanding of what a situation needed that Eleanor appreciated without ever saying so directly. When Vera left, she had a full notebook and a list of names. The Land Commission contact, a fair lawyer in Guthrie, a banker at First Territorial who was straight with people, and something in her face that was different from when she'd arrived. Not more certain, more specific. The look of someone who has converted a vague determination into a concrete plan. Eleanor watched her wagon go down the road and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not nostalgia exactly, because the feeling wasn't about the past. It was about the line between then and now, the distance between the woman on the train platform and the woman standing on this porch, and how that distance had been built out of every small specific decision that could have gone differently and hadn't. Rhett came to stand beside her. "She'll be all right," he said. "I don't know that," Eleanor said. "It's hard." "You did it." "I almost didn't," she said. "About 6 times." He looked at her. "But you didn't not do it." She looked at him. "That's a terrible sentence." "It's still true." She looked back at the road where Vera's wagon had gone around the bend and disappeared into the flat afternoon, and she thought, yes, it is. There is a thing people say about the frontier, that it takes everything you have and gives you back something unrecognizable. Eleanor had found, in the years she'd been here, that this was only half right. It took everything you'd been planning on and gave you back something you hadn't planned for. Whether that was better depended entirely on what you were willing to make of the unplanned thing. She had been willing. That, in the end, was the only thing she'd brought to that train platform in November that turned out to matter. Not the $31, not the knowledge of accounts, not even the particular stubbornness that made her stay when anyone reasonable would have left. Just the willingness to be in the place she was in and figure out what it actually asked of her. The wind came off the north pasture the way it always did in the late afternoon, with its unfiltered opinion of the season, and she turned her face into it for a moment and let it hit her. Then she went back inside because there was work to do, and the work, as always, was waiting.